Scary Stories Collection 5 Short Horror Stories. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Monsters. It was the same day that I received my PhD that my grandmother shattered everything I thought I knew. In total, I had been studying for 7 years, beginning with zoology and then transferring to straight biology, completing my master's a year later, and whilst taking up teaching duties at the university, completing my PhD over the following years. By that point, I was an academic of some standing, and the papers I had written had gained some attention within some select circles interested in those sorts of things. But I was tired. 7 years is a long time. The process of reaching these milestones in my academic progress was exhausting. The hours and intellectual demands taxing on both the body and mind. Not to mention the crippling homesickness that I had felt ever since starting my undergraduate qualification. I had left my home in Turkey aged 19 for a scholarship place at a top university in the United States. Whilst I loved my friends, the lecturers, and the challenge of the courses I completed there, and thanked God every day for the opportunities I had been given, from day one I felt the nagging weight on my shoulders, the feeling in my chest like a hollow space, a gap where something was missing. I had first felt it sitting in a fast food restaurant just off campus. In the frenzied excitement and hectic activity of arriving in a new place and meeting everyone, I had missed breakfast. By the time I'd moved into my student digs, lunch had also fallen by the wayside, and when finally one of my new friends suggested that we grab a bite to eat, I was famished. When the food finally arrived, I regarded it with a certain amount of disbelief, and felt in the pit of my stomach, somewhere below its angry growling, the first sharp pangs of homesickness. At home, grabbing a meal on the streets meant visiting a jokanta, mountains of buttered pilaf rice studded with nahut, the chunky swollen chickpeas bathed in a thin tomato sauce. What I got instead hardly even qualified as a burger, seeing as how it looked nothing like the advertisement and more like the server had spent the past half hour sitting on it. I chewed it anyway and tried to prepare myself mentally for years of similar disappointments. The winters were especially hard. Not because they were more severe, but because they never quite made it too severe. In my US home, the skies simply greyed into a seemingly eternal cycle of drizzle and rain. The temperature dropped, but not dramatically, not enough to change daily life into an entirely different prospect. Winter in the US was a seemingly endless string of damp commutes, sniffling noses, and steamy classrooms, all framed by the darkness that greeted me when I rose in the morning and waited for me outside of the lecture halls and laboratories to accompany me home when I ended my day. In Turkey, winter was different. There, winter was stark, fresh with raw, bracing clarity. Vistas of snow orbiting, ice-clean air into which we could step to collect pomegranate and citrus fruits, or to chop firewood to light the soba. The metallic construction that would heat our homes, wrapped and cloaked like cocoons, laden with thick blankets, heavy rugs, and roughly stitched cushions, as we huddled in comfort against the cold. It was in these settings, in the warm glow of the fire, sipping amber tea from tulip-shaped glasses, that my grandmother would share with me the folktales of her youth and horror stories of her nightmares. The same stories from which she plucked the thing that made my studies seem to crumble. My grandmother was an interesting woman in almost every respect. For me, she seemed always to glow with a golden aura of warmth, her toothless grin and sparkling eyes speaking always of mirth and mischief that bubbled just below the surface. For her family, and especially for children, she was this soft, quilted figure of benevolent matriarchy. Only on exceedingly rare occasions did we catch a glimpse of the granite will and resilience that had gotten her family through. For there was little doubt in my mind that beneath the layers of cardigans and shawls, my grandmother was as hard as nails. Having grown up in a rural village where shepherding was still a common profession, and the threats to flocks from bears and wolves was a real and immediate concern, she knew how to use a rifle and what the bite of true cold felt like. She had fought with fists and tools against jealous neighbours and violent men, and could drink a sailor under the table when it came to sinking beers. Her life in the village had been hard, her early days in the city harder, and I often thought it was these experiences that helped her to flesh out her stories, to weave a narrative by somehow sewing threads from the dark outside into the fabric of the story, chilling the blood in a way I have never experienced from any novel or movie. Many was the time, she would tell us, that she would sit around a fire in the pastures, the protection of the light extending only as far as the glow of the flames, as the night and the things that hid within it circled quietly around her. In the mountains, a place where a story of monsters could be interrupted by howls from the nearby forest, it was easy to believe the terrors that spilled from the tongues of others, easy to give credence to the implausible, and easy for maybes to become truths. When she told tales of monsters, they somehow sounded real. And yet, it was the urban stories, the weeds that grew not in open fields, but through cracks in the concrete, that haunted me the most. And chief among all of those fears was the oku. Oku has its equivalent in almost every culture on Earth. In the US, it would be referred to simply as the boogeyman, though in Turkish folklore, the thing is far from human. I remember distinctly, as a child, the day that my father and his friend Orkan carried a huge stand-up closet into the house. The wardrobe, as my mother would call it, was an immense rectangular construction with several drawers at the bottom and 2 doors that opened onto a rail on which clothes, coats, and other such items could be hung. It had been discarded by some other family and left by the trash on account of the wood in the base having given way on one side, an injury to its structure that gave the whole thing a leaning, palsied look when it was first propped against the wall. Having shifted it into the living room, my father took a few steps back and regarded the massive piece of furniture with his hands on his hips, as we, the children, waited for him to deliver his famous line, the line with which he always greeted the broken, damaged, and disregarded items that found their way via the trash into our home. When he finally nodded and said aloud, "I can fix that," we had all clapped. Little did I realize that within weeks I would come to hate that closet, and perhaps, more accurately, to fear it. Once fixed, propped with wood and new legs that my father took from a discarded table and refashioned with his chisel to fit the job, the closet was an impressive piece of furniture. A few days later, my father painted the entire thing a pale sky blue, and after it had dried, moved it, with help and much heaving and cursing, up the stairs, and into the corridor of the second floor outside my grandmother's room. This was to be her closet, and it stood outside her door like a sentinel, guarding the entrance and discouraging curious children from entering her room. When the imposing piece of furniture proved not to be enough deterrent on its own, my grandmother reached into her sack full of myths and installed for us a gatekeeper, someone, or rather something, who ensured that we never ascended that second flight of stairs or crossed the private threshold of her room. That gatekeeper was the oku, and he lived in the closet. Thickened by years of smoking a pipe, a decidedly masculine and typically contrarian habit for her, which served to demonstrate her lack of concern for what anyone else thought, my grandmother's voice had an almost supernatural ability to hit the deep and resonant baritones only usually achieved by barrel-chested men. Whenever she spoke of oku, it was this voice that my grandmother would use, leaning forward in her chair and extending her hand like a claw before dragging it back in a ripping, tearing motion that was unambiguous in its meaning. The oku, she said, fed on the flesh of children, and would, if it so pleased, crawl and slither from its pit below the closet in the dead of night, searching for prey. It is strange that for a thing that so fully occupied my fears, in my mind, the oku was never quite fully formed. Instead, it danced on the edge of the view, just out of range, glimpsed only in fragments and partially hidden in shadow. If asked to draw the creature or give a full description, I believe I would have struggled. Yet, I knew enough. In my mind, this faintly seen thing was a slick-skinned shadow, a massive, stalking thing, lithely muscled and horribly strong, that slinked forward on all fours, its jagged teeth arching outward hungrily as its hands, huge and taloned, would grope and stretch toward its victim and grasp with predatory intent. When, as an adult reminiscing about these childhood fears, I asked my sister how she had imagined oku, she said that she had been too young to take the story in. But then when she did picture it, it was something like a horse, made wrong. It was an odd description, and yet it rang true for me. The image of some crippled horse trying to spill its ill-formed limbs from the closet and drag itself quietly across the landing somehow made sense, as if the main elements of a man, a horse, and crocodile could mix to form an abomination. A thing of immense size, holding the same furious power stretched through its muscles as a stallion, and yet collapsed into unnatural angles, the bones stretching and bracing against the skin, while its hands, and of course its mouth, were adorned with claws and teeth. A horse made wrong seemed right, but it was the made wrong part that seemed to fit best. Though I never went up those stairs, never stood before that closet after it was dragged to the second floor, its image haunted my young mind. I remember now, with crystal clarity, how at night, alone in my room, I would hear the creaks and shifts of the old house, silent save for my shallow breathing, the aching moans of the floorboards contracting above me, as, in my mind, something of strange and peculiar movements crept further toward me. I remember how I would lie there, looking up at the blank white oblong of the ceiling, hearing those soft shuffling movements, and shiver in my bed. Night after night I would lie there, flickering images of claws and teeth darting through the space behind my thoughts, as I wondered if, perhaps, one of those noises, one of those creaks, was the sound of the closet door as it yawned slowly open. I remember too how on many nights, sure that I was right, that the crack between the closet's two doors had widened, eased open, and allowed something hellish to emerge, I would drag the blanket up and around my head like a shell, convinced that to leave even an inch of flesh exposed was to invite the creeping thing to find me. I knew with terrifying certainty that if I let my foot slip out from beneath this protective cloak, a taloned hand would no doubt take it and drag me away into the closet to be consumed. Sometimes I would huddle in this way for hours, the sweat pouring from me as every breath quick and panicked heated my cocoon. I would curl myself small, the blankets damp, and despite the discomfort, I would never, even for a second, allow myself to break cover, to peep my head above the bedclothes for fear of what might be waiting, squatted in the corner of my room. Nor was it just at night, for even in the day, in those old houses, the dark was able to find you. Sometimes I would climb the stairs to my room and hear above a shift or whisper of movement. The stairs in these houses were never lit, save for the small window at the top of the first flight. From that crack's pale glow, long shadows formed, and at the slightest sound, I would stop dead. Too far, I knew, from the safety of downstairs, too close to the next flight, where he might be waiting. I would freeze, hold my breath, and listen, my ears sifting through the sounds, the muffled conversations from far below, the tiniest specks of sound outside, a dog barking perhaps, the tinkling songs of birds, and below it, the hush. The not merely silence, but the deliberate, conscious quiet of things trying to be still, waiting and wanting not to be heard, of things that padded ever closer as they stalked and hunted in the dark. Often I would lose my nerve, decide that the book or toy I had come to retrieve was not worth the trip. I would stand, paralyzed with fear, waiting for the hush to be broken, and, when it was, by some new creak of rattling in the eaves, would sprint in abject terror, tumbling and freewheeling down the stairs, breath choking hard in my throat and heart pounding wildly, and I would spill back into the living room, into the light, and be met by the curious glances of my family, though I always suspected that my grandmother knew. For whenever I took one of these runs, crashed back into the room from the shadow of the stairs, pursued in my mind by clawed hands, she would watch me curiously, sitting in her armchair opposite the door, a spool of knitting draped in her lap. She would see me out of breath, trying to gain composure, and would smile in a way that said she knew. He was running from Oku. As it turned out, she knew more than that. She knew all along that I had reason to run. Receiving my PhD in front of my family was one of the proudest moments of my life. 4 rows back, with a grin so wide it seemed it would escape from her face and spill onto the floor, my grandmother had clapped her hands together and shouted when I had been handed my certificate. That she had agreed to travel to the US for the ceremony at all was a miracle, especially as she had spent much of her life swearing every oath available that she would never get into one of those flying airmobile machines. As it turns out, she had not only flown across the Atlantic, but, secreted away in her checked luggage, had brought something with her. It was later that same day, after I had eaten with my family and shared drinks, that I was left alone with Grandma. It had been agreed that she and my sister would stay over at my rented apartment whilst the rest of my family camped out at a hotel across town. The general agreement being that she would be more comfortable in my home and would be able to avoid commuting every day. Following the ceremony, she had come with the rest of my family back to the apartment, and after I had shown her the room I'd prepared for her on the ground floor, had made herself comfortable in the old armchair and not moved since. After waving my folks goodbye and seeing my sister off to bed, I returned to the living room to find my grandmother rooting through an old leather bag that she had open on her lap. I made some indications that we should both be off to bed too, when she glanced up and told me quite abruptly to sit down and listen. I smiled at this. Though I was now a qualified doctor, I had a feeling I was about to receive some further education from my grandmother. I pulled up the small footstool so that I could sit by her feet and asked her what the matter was. From the bag, she produced another small velvet bag, tied with a drawstring that dropped heavily with the weight of the object inside. I eyed her curiously and smiled, wondering what kind of surprise she had in store for me when I caught sight of her expression. Earlier she had been elated and for much of the evening had drunk and made merry, celebrating with the rest of us. Now, though, she looked melancholy and tired. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked, suddenly concerned. She tightened her grip on the bag, and after a few moments in which she seemed to consider whether or not to let me in on her secret, said, "I want to tell you a story." "Do you remember," she asked, "the day I stopped mentioning Oku?" The word, spilling from her lips, sent a crackle of electricity up my spine and made my hair stand on end. She had leaned forward in the chair, her voice taking on that same sinister deepness that it had years before. I thought about her question. Of course, there had to have been a day, the last time that the childhood boogeyman was mentioned. But it was in the same way that there was the last time that your mother ever carried you, or the last time you played soccer with one particular childhood friend. You never realized at the time or remembered the specific occasion afterward. I shook my head, wondering where this was leading. Grandma leaned forward further and fixed her eyes on mine. In a voice that retained its low, masculine growl, but which was now reduced to a whisper, she said, "I do. There was a night," she began, "when you were perhaps 9 years old. I had gone to bed early and was sitting up reading when I heard a creak on the second flight of stairs. At first I thought it was just the house, making the usual wails and moans when I heard it again, a sharp, keening whine, and realized that it was someone stepping ever so softly on the bottom stair of the second flight. I placed down my book, looked toward the open door into the dark outside, and listened. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then again, the creak, the press and release of weight placed and gently, deliberately lifted by someone trying to be as quiet as possible. I smiled to myself, knowing instantly that it was your sister. Over the past few weeks, I had noticed that the amount of perfume in the bottle I kept in the dresser by the door was reducing. When passing by your sister's room one day, I happened to catch the same scent and realized that she was applying drops of this precious liquid onto her dolly, a tiny, red-headed rag doll she called Polly. At the mention of this specific name, the image of the doll, unsummoned for years, leapt to the forefront of my mind. Every week or so, she would climb the stairs and secretly take just a few drops, pouring them onto Polly. She was younger than you and had never taken the tales of Oku quite as seriously. I had never been able to catch her taking the perfume, and now, hearing her on the stairs, decided to give her a fright that would discourage her from coming up the stairs again. Carefully, so as not to make too much noise, I swung my legs out of bed and crept as quietly as I could toward the door. Then I waited. Again, the soft, partly cushioned creak, closer now as she moved further up the stairs. I stood just inside the doorframe and decided to try to look out and see how far she had gotten up the stairs. I did not want to scare her if she had come too far up, for fear that she might fall if startled. I therefore rested my shoulder against the door and leaned my head out. As I did, however, I heard another, different sound to my left, not as with the other from the stairs themselves, but from the closet that stood at the top of the flight. The sound was a low, weighty shuffling, as if something had fallen or was moving within the wardrobe itself. I stared for a moment, confused as to what could be making such a sound, when, all at once, the door of the closet began to swing open. Instantly, my mind leaped for explanations. Perhaps a draft had blown it open. Perhaps the weight of me moving forward had shifted the wood, and a loose hinge had allowed the weight of the door to swing gently open. Ideas and reasons swam and swarmed in my head, none of them convincing. Below, I heard the quick scurrying as your sister bolted in response to the door opening, a quick tumble of footfalls as she, no doubt scared stiff, ran for the safety of her room. I stared at the door, the hard angle of its edge now standing at 90 degrees from the rest of its structure and 90 degrees to me. I stepped forward, abandoning my plan for a scare, to close the cupboard, and stopped dead in my tracks. Looking out, I could see that the shadow formed by the space inside the closet wasn't quite right. Instead of ending with the sharp, angular line that it should, it instead seemed to be spilling or leaking in some kind of strange mound, out and over the lip of the cavity onto the space at the top of the stairs. Stepping backward into my room, I pulled at my lamp, trying to angle it toward the door to get a better view. What I saw made my legs turn to rubber. There, at the very edge of the closet, was a hand, huge and articulated, groping forward like an immense spider on thick, spindly limbs. It moved slowly forward, emerging from the cupboard and arching hungrily toward the stairs, toward that second flight and the scent of the child that had passed by its lair. For a moment I simply stood, not knowing what to do, whether to call out or scream. How, I thought, would anyone get up here quick enough to help? How would I escape if the thing turned and pursued me into the dead-end confines of my room? And how could I stop this thing from slithering down those stairs and toward the ones I loved? Here she stopped, her lip trembling as the fear and emotion she had felt that day once again swirled within her. Looking up at me, her eyes watery and wide, she threw the bag toward me. I caught it and felt that within was something long, hard, and at some points sharp. My grandmother's face, that had for a second showed a glimpse of despair, hardened, her lips pursing and the skin of her face seeming to tighten over the old bones of her face. I knew it was heading downstairs. I knew what it was after, but I also knew that against the wall I had your grandfather's axe. She gestured for me to open the bag. Monsters are real, my son. They exist in this world, and if they exist here, then they can be hurt. What I found inside, I cannot to this day explain any better than I can what followed. It was a hand, about twice the size of a full-grown man's. It was of a greyish-blue colour, each finger sporting a hooked, bird-like talon of terrible sharpness. Turning the thing in my hand, I saw that the underneath of the fingers and the palm itself were lined with rows of tiny back curved claws, of a hard scimitar shape, like those of a cat. These claws meant that whatever was gripped would be hooked and held, the skin tearing even at the first touch. The reason I remember so clearly the last time I mentioned Oku is because it was the day before we all moved out. That was the last night that any of us slept in that house. Within a week, we had moved on. Memories, as fresh and clear as if they had happened moments ago, came to my mind, as if they had been lying below the surface of soil that had now been freshly churned up. My mother, in tears, packing trunks of belongings, no explanations of why we were leaving, my father and uncle packing boxes of things, and us staying for a few weeks at my aunt's house before finding a new place, living out of suitcases. I remembered my indignation, even as a child, at not being given any reason for the move, or even notice that it was happening. One day we were there, the next we weren't. Finally, in some way, it now made sense. Your father raised holy hell when I said we had to go, but he quieted down when I showed him this. I looked again at the hand. It is an odd experience that few will ever have, to hold another's severed hand in your own. Because they are attached and indeed animated, we do not think of our own hands as heavy. When we hold the hand of another person, it is similarly lightened by the life within it. Holding a severed hand, one is instantly surprised by how heavy it seems. This thing was heavier still. "What the hell is this?" I asked when I was again able to speak. "My son," she head bowed. "You are a doctor now. This is what I want you to find out." And so I did. Or at least, I tried. Over the next week, I ran tests on this specimen, taking samples of the skin, clippings from the claws, even samples from the coarse black hairs that lined the surface towards the wrist, where the hand had been severed by the swing of my grandfather's axe. Some, I know, would have thought this a joke, some prank played by a mischievous grandmother on her newly qualified grandson. But not me. I had seen the way that Grandma had looked at me, heard the wavering cracks in her voice, chasms opened by panic and fear. What it was and what it meant, I didn't know, but her story, that I believed. I therefore treated this relic of folklore and myth as a genuine specimen. The blanket of fear that shrouded my actions undercut with thoughts of what it would mean if I were able to prove, to show the world, that this thing, this boogeyman, was real. I worked tirelessly, running the samples against other species with similar traits. The results were baffling. Everything came back blank. That is not to say that they came back inconclusive or corrupted in some way. Rather, they came back as zero, as empty, as if no sample or data had been entered, or as if the test had not been run at all. After rerunning every test multiple times, my frustration increasing with every repetition, I finally reasoned that there must be some property in the specimen itself that was stopping me from achieving the correct analysis. That night, I called Grandma and asked for her permission. The following day, I invited 7 of my most learned and respected colleagues, including 2 of my professors, to examine the sample. I sent them an email, minutes after finishing up with my grandmother, explaining in detail the myth, my grandmother's story, and what exactly I had for them to look at. Without exception, they all responded favourably, some almost giddy in anticipation. The next day, in a laboratory at the university, I carefully removed the specimen from the bag and laid it out onto the table for my colleagues to examine. After a few moments of silence, one began to laugh. The others looked deeply disgruntled, and one simply turned and walked from the room. "Is this some kind of joke?" asked one of my favourite professors after a moment. I stared back at him, confused. "I mean, what is the idea? That it's invisible? Or are you making some point about fairy tales? I don't get it." I looked from the hand back to my colleagues and realized that every one of them was looking past the sample, either at the desk below it or at me. They couldn't see it. I reached for the hand, cupping it in my own. I lifted it and held it up for them. "Wait, are you telling me you can't see this?" The men laughed uncomfortably. "Yeah, good one. Now, if you'll excuse us," and with that, they left. All but Francine, one of my favourite professors and my supervisor for my PhD. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, and began to speak, before stopping and, instead of walking out of the room, beckoning me to follow her. Dutifully, I went with her and found that she was leading me past the admin block to security. She walked into the booth and shared some words with the 2 guards who were sitting there, before a huge collection of tiny screens. One, sighing wearily and somewhat reluctant to leave his chair, rose to his feet, pushed a button, and pointed to one of the screens. Francine beckoned me inside. Before me was the live feed security footage for every laboratory in this building, including my own. As I watched, I saw myself and the assembled professors moving backwards in sped-up motions as a security guard rewound the feed. Eventually, at Francine's say-so, he pressed play. There on screen was I, holding up the hand for the others. Francine turned to the 2 security guards and asked them what I was holding in my hands. Though she and I could see the specimen, the two men agreed. "Nothing," they said in unison. Francine and I have discussed many times what we thought was occurring, why she and I could both see the hand. She shared with me her childhood fears. For her, it was El Coco, another version of the boogeyman in whom, for much of her childhood, she had passionately believed. Though we could perhaps guess, neither of us could quite explain scientifically why we could see the specimen and the others couldn't. Though, as we found out later, at least one other clearly could. 2 days after my meeting with the other professors, there was a break-in at the labs. Though all the other specimens were left untouched, my boogeyman's hand was taken and has never been recovered. Whether it was destroyed, taken for further tests by some other agency, or filed away in some vault to conceal evidence that might cause widespread panic, I do not know. What I do know is that once, for almost a week, I held in my hands concrete evidence that monsters are real, that there are things that go bump in the night, and that children are right to be scared of the dark. I know, dear reader, that you will regard the above as a work of fiction, an amusing tale for which there is no real evidence, and that is fine. All I will say in conclusion is that knowing what I know, I sleep in a bed that rests against the floor. There is no under my bed. Knowing what I know, I have chosen to keep a portable rail on which to store my clothes, and I do not have a closet. Knowing what I know, I let my children sleep with a nightlight, and I run with my heart racing into their rooms any time they mention monsters. At the time of writing this, there are over 15,000 missing persons in the US alone. I am sure, and indeed hopeful, that many of them will eventually be found. But knowing what I know, I worry that some may already be lost forever. Having heard this story, you now know what I know. All I ask, dear reader, is that you take sensible precautions. Monsters are real. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Mr. Strings. As he led me into the back of the store, the light from the outside world fading into a tangled forest of knickknacks and curios, I began to think that perhaps, finally, I had found the place, and that this, after all my searching, could be something special. I had been scouring the junk shops, antique dealers, and curio shops of this particular city for over a month, sifting through the myriad and manifold collections of disparate delights, looking for that one treasure that would be the centerpiece of my exhibit. I had, it is true, discovered several interesting artifacts amongst the cornucopia of dross and useless things, but nothing that stood out to me as a genuine one-of-a-kind object of curiosity, such as would make visitors to the exhibit gasp or force the tiny hairs on the backs of their necks to stand on end. Now, finally, I hoped I may have found such an item. The exhibition, Creatures, Collections and Curios, had been booked for months. The idea was to arrange one room of the gallery into the appearance of an old curiosity shop, overlaying and storing a vast array of things from around the world and showing through these tangible, solid objects the power of narrative. My idea was for the visitor to be able to tour these objects and artifacts with a headset that would allow them to access information on each piece as they lifted it or pointed to it. In China, I had visited a row of antique shops that guidebooks advised visitors to frequent, not for the experience of buying anything, but because every single object stuffed onto the shelves or hiding in the nooks and crannies of the place had a story. A tale of its origins and providence that the owners would unravel for the curious visitor. On their own, the objects themselves were often worthless, or at least of extraordinarily little value. Once the story is linked to them, once the words were wound around them like golden threads of spider silk, their value rose exponentially. It was the story, not the solidity, that mattered, the woven and often invisible blanket of mist that shrouded the object and which would allow the owner to explain some detail about the piece. The experience for the visitor was to revel in the exploration of the histories that attached themselves to these objects. Therein lay the curiosity, and it was this experience I wanted to recreate. To that end, I had spent the past 2 years touring the world, visiting the markets, bazaars, and backstreet hovels where knowledgeable or inventive proprietors would regale me with the tales of their wares. Sometimes the plainest and least conspicuous of objects, a silver coin, a diary with every entry handwritten backward, or a tiny marble frog, would have the strangest and most outlandish tales attached to them. Like the black rose, beautifully carved from ebony and kept in a gorgeous velvet-lined box, that the owner assured me had once belonged to a vampire, and which he would not sell me for any price on account of how dangerous he considered it to be. Or the blackthorn stang or wand that the owner of a small curio shop in the north of England told me had belonged to old Demdike of the Pendle witches, and which had been used to cast spells and bring harm to many over the years. Which was, in essence, and without such a tale of its origins, just a stick. On the other hand, some objects that appear to have potential, beautifully carved or strikingly grotesque, would turn out either to have no story attached at all, or some quickly fabricated nonsense that the owner had come up with on the spot. Many was the time that I had been enchanted by the gruesome tales of some figurine or hideously carved fetish doll and its many exploits, assured of its one-of-a-kind and unique nature, only to find dozens of the same figurines sitting in rows like soldiers on a stall in some tourist market not 200 yards away. Or turned over an aged-looking artifact that was alleged to have passed through the hands of Rasputin himself, only to find the words "Made in China" emblazoned on the bottom. The best finds were those for which some fragments of the story could be proven. When a verifiable link between the yarn and provable historical fact could be established. It was all well and good hearing that this medal had been worn by 5 generations of the same family in 5 different conflicts, and that its warped shape was due to it having stopped bullets on 2 occasions, but to then see photographs of the men wearing the medal, in photographs spanning decades if not centuries, made the find far more special. Then I would feel my heart leap a little at the discovery of something genuinely worthy of curiosity. And so it was, in a tiny but almost comically overcrowded junk shop, that I found myself following a wizened old man into a section of the shop I had not even known existed to look at a very special item. I had explained what I was looking for, that I valued items that had a backstory, that I was particularly interested in those items with a provable history, and that my wallet would most likely open if the piece had some sinister or supernatural link, and watched as the owner of the shop raised his eyebrows, hesitated for a moment, and then said he had just the thing. The shop itself was one of those junk shops in which the items seemed to loom inward, as if the corridors and passageways formed by the shelves were pathways in some dark forest, the trees on either side stretching their branches in grasping arches overhead, straining to feel the touch of another. In such places, the items seemed to lean toward one in such a way that if the passage is observed from a distance it looks almost like a tunnel, with rounded sides, the paintings, figures, ornaments and instruments curving inward to surround the visitor. At the end of one of these labyrinthine corridors was an immense painting that stretched almost from the floor to the ceiling, in front of which were stacked brasses and a variety of utensils used to stoke an old wooden fire. So large was this painting that it seemed to form the back wall of the shop, and I had assumed was either pressed up against it or nailed to it. It was then quite a surprise to watch the little man lift a curtain which had been draped over a hat stand to one side of the painting, and disappear by stepping into the darkness behind it, into an area I had not even realized was there. Following him cautiously, I came around the back of the painting and found a set of stone steps leading downwards, and which my companion, with the aid of a flashlight he had suddenly acquired from somewhere, was descending. Again, I followed. Cautious of wasting time listening to an old wives' tale, I again emphasized the need for the items to be linked to a verifiable story. The old man looked back at me as he cautiously placed his foot on each step and gave me a shallow smile. Then, in a phrase that seemed strangely anachronistic in this cavalcade of antique wonders, said, "If your friends have Google, they can check," before adding cryptically, "I tell you no lies. You see, he has scrapbook. Everything in there. Mr. String's bad, but he very real." Two things in this sentence piqued my interest. Firstly, the reference to a scrapbook, which I hoped, as it seemed to promise, would collect together some historical details about the piece beyond the hearsay and fanciful inventions of the junk shop's owner. Secondly, and more strikingly, the repeated references to the item Mr. Strings, not as an it, but as a he. Eventually, the proprietor led me to an ancient-looking chest of drawers and told me to wait as he shuffled off into some other dark corner of this lower room and disappeared. For a few moments I simply stood, waiting, looking around the room. It was darker in here even than in the main shop, the entire place lit by the single bulb from a small Art Deco lamp in the corner. I waited for perhaps a minute, straining my ears to try to follow the old man's movements, back up the stone steps or across the floor of the main shop above. Instead, there was only silence. The atmosphere inside the room was warm and a little stuffy, as all seldom visited rooms are when entered, the air newly disturbed after months, perhaps years, of waiting statically, swilling slowly and lethargically around, conjuring up the ghosts of scents and aromas long forgotten. In the case of this room, it was a mix of old furniture polish, fur, and mould, a sickly sweet echo of an odour like that of flowers long rotted. It was the smell of age and decay. I leaned against the chest of drawers and yawned, a gesture that even then I realized was dramatically exaggerated, partially for my benefit. To break the silence, to underscore the fact that unlike everything else in this room, I was alive, living in the present and capable of movement. I shifted my feet, feeling the strange need to create sound, to keep moving lest I fall into a stupor and become just another static object in the room, waiting, frozen and forgotten, to collect dust. Again, I listened, wondering where in the hell the old man had gotten to when, beside me, something moved. It was a quick, wrenching jerk of a sound, as something pulled or dragged across a hard surface. I looked down at the chest of drawers and in particular at the third drawer, which had been fastened shut with a clasp lock and not one but two padlocks. The sound, I would swear if asked, seemed to come from somewhere within or behind that drawer, as if something within the drawer had moved of its own accord, the flat, hollow sound resonating through the sides of the wood and the thin bottom of the drawer itself. I bent slightly toward it. The chest of drawers itself was of marbled green colour and dating from around the turn of the last century. I stared at the drawer and more precisely at the locks, watching them closely for even the slightest whisper of movement. There was none. But then, the sound again. A dull, almost cushioned thud from within, as something shifted and then, by the smallest increment of degrees, I watched as the bottom edge of the first brass lock shifted ever so slightly. I took a step back. Was it possible that there was something alive in there? Perhaps a rodent that had gnawed through the wood and become trapped inside, or some serpent kept in this cruel and unconventional manner that had been aroused and pressed against an edge. I began to feel slightly uncomfortable and realized that I was repeatedly glancing back toward the stairs and wishing that the old man would hurry up and return. Hurry up and join me so that I would no longer be alone down here. I waited for a moment to see if the sound would come again and realized that I was flinching at the thought, each second without the sound stretching out like acres of time as I waited, like a dog that shrinks from an anticipated blow from a cruel owner, for the noise to come again. It didn't, and so I simply stood, alone in the near dark with my eyes flitting between the stairs and that third locked drawer, waiting, either for the old man's footsteps or another shift from somewhere within the drawers. Finally, there was a gravelly scrape of dust underfoot as the old man began to descend the stairs, the light from his torch dancing against the wall and casting strange elongated shadows as the ornaments and artifacts all seemed to jump toward the light, hoping to escape the paralysis of their prisons. Without a word, the old man tottered past me and towards the chest of drawers. In his hand, he held an ancient-looking key loop of the kind you would expect a jailer in some medieval dungeon to own. It consisted of an iron ring onto which dozens of keys of various shapes and sizes were affixed. With a jangling clatter of metal, the old man opened the first, modern lock, and with some difficulty managed to unclip the second, far older-looking lock as well. Before opening the drawer, he paused and looked me square in the eye, staring up from under his heavy brow and prodigious eyebrows with a resigned, almost melancholy look, as if trying to decide something. It was as if he were reading the lines on my face, trying to rearrange them into the characters of some forgotten script that would give him an insight into me and my motivations. It was an unnerving experience, made all the more unsettling by the man's obvious trepidation, underscored by the fact that as he removed the first padlock, his hands were visibly shaking. Finally, sliding the loop of the second padlock out from the clasp, he said, "You are okay down here, by yourself? Nothing strange?" He spat these questions in an abrupt rapid fire of words that turned them from being true questions into statements, reassurances for himself that helped to smooth over and flatten any cracks in his resolve. For a moment I became suspicious, wondering whether the sounds I had heard had been somehow prearranged, and that this entire scenario was set up either as a way of frightening me or increasing the dramatic effect of the sales pitch. Looking at his gaze, however, at the genuine searching in his eyes, and perhaps, I thought, behind it all, a genuine undercurrent of reluctance, even fear, I decided that this was not the case. I thought of mentioning the sounds, but decided against it, suspecting that it could be used as an excuse not to open the drawer, and instead sidestepped the question by beckoning him to continue. As I mentioned before, sometimes the nature of the object and the depth of its supposed backstory do not match. The most innocuous objects having the most horrific tales attached, whilst the most grotesque are simply ornamental or linked to only the least imaginative of second-rate ghost stories. With Mr. Strings, this was not the case. With him, the object and the story were perfectly matched, each as hideous as the other. Inside the drawer, lying on his back and staring directly upward, was Mr. Strings. He was resting, his hands limp by his sides in a small wooden case, the lid of which was clear glass so that he looked as if he were lying in a state like some deceased dictator awaiting a procession of faithful subjects. Mr. Strings, I should explain, was a puppet, but a puppet like none I had ever seen before. A marionette, he lived up to his name by having his appendages and joints attached to long lengths of wire or string. These cords ran through his hands, wrists, the points of his knees, feet, the elbows, neck, and head, so that in the hands of a skilled puppeteer he could be moved and articulated in such a way that his movements could mimic life. I say mimic because even the slightest glance would confirm that Mr. Strings was far from alive. The work and craftsmanship on the puppet itself were masterful, but in a strange contrast was a perfectly lifelike depiction of death. The entire body looked as if it had been shriveled, dried out over centuries, and withered down to its current size. At first I was drawn to the hands, to the tiny exquisite detail of each finger. I remembered the times when I had looked at my sister's newborn son and marvelled at the miniature perfection of his fingernails, and recoiled as my mind conjured the comparison between something so perfect and this hideous monstrosity. For worse, far worse than the hands, was the face. Mr. String's face was of a taut, leathery brown, the surface carving somehow polished and textured so that it appeared to be formed from a single piece of stretched shoe leather. Unlike most puppets on which the angle of the chisel makes straight or pointed lines that speak of having been fashioned by the hands of men, looked moulded, stretched, and warped, yet somehow rounded and organic. A gently sloping chin fell away beneath another curiosity, 2 rows of perfectly fashioned teeth, again minute in scale, but almost absurdly lifelike in their rendering. Whether fashioned from shells or ivory I could not tell at a glance, but beyond their shape it was the attention to the imperfections, the staining, textures and slight chips as of a real mouth that made their death's head grin, framed as it was by shriveled, peeled-back lips, all the more repulsive. Yet even this was not the peak of the thing's abhorrence. That honour was reserved for the eyes, which, resting below a sunken brow, seemed in their glassy stillness to have retained much of the life they reflected. The iris was the milky blue of autumn skies, the breadth of the white tinged around with red, making them seem to stare wildly outward with a crazed, maniacal glare, of the kind one sees on fish lying cold and lifeless on a bed of ice in a fishmonger's window. As I looked down into the drawer, the box, and at Mr. String's, I could feel the old man's eyes upon me, watching me as I observed this strange prize, and as I traced my fingers along the wood of the box, the surface of the glass, smiled as I leaped backward, recoiling with the speed of a striking snake when I saw the eyes move. I am not ashamed to say that I screamed, nor am I such a fool that I do not know that many hearing this will think me mad, mistaken, or simply a liar. All I can do then is assure you that I am none of these things and insist on every fibre of my being that I saw what I saw. Insist that as my hand travelled gently up the length of the glass, over the tiny, tattered suit in which Mr. Strings had been crudely dressed, I saw the fleshy orbs of his eyes roll, ever so slightly, to the right. Whether it was a trick of the light, some illusion created by shadow, or the way the old man moved his torchlight, I don't know, but the effect was undeniable, and to this day I am inclined to believe that it was no illusion. As I leaped backward, however, the old man simply watched, stoic and unmoved, his steady, unfaltering gaze holding within it a questioning denial. I, for my part, struggled to find words, to force the sounds to form and articulate, and instead simply pointed desperately into the third drawer coffin, my finger jabbing accusingly and repeatedly at the tiny figurine lying prone in the box. The old man shook his head. "Did not move," he said flatly. "Mr. String's puppet cannot move. Cannot ever move." He made this proclamation in the same low, soft voice with which he had convinced me to go down there in the first place, and yet, in the finality of their conviction, they may as well have been carved in granite. The message was clear. Whatever I thought I saw, he did not want to know, nor was he willing to be convinced, even if I told him. With gentle, reverent care, as if lifting a baby from its crib, the old man leaned forward and dipped his hands into the drawer. For a moment, I thought of telling him to stop, of rushing forward and preventing him from committing a terrible mistake. Instead, I simply watched as he scooped and lifted from the drawer, not the box containing the puppet, but the large, hard-backed book that lay at his feet. Cradling the book in the nook of his arm, he gestured with his other arm for me to sit in an antique dining room chair that was pressed against one of the overstuffed shelves. I duly complied, my senses still swimming from the shock of what I had seen, what I thought I had seen. The old man handed me the book and, easing himself backward with an almost audible creak, lowered himself into a seat directly opposite me, intending to wait whilst I read the contents. Though this was a rather unsettling setup, I was glad of the old man's company. To my right, the chest of drawers still stood, the third drawer still open for Mr. Strings to stare blankly, lifelessly upward. Opening the heavy tome, I recognised immediately that this was the scrapbook of which the old man had spoken. A cursory flip through the pages showed it to be composed of various clippings from newspaper articles, receipts, advertisements, and the like, that at first glance seemed to be unrelated. Curiously, the scrapbook also seemed to work in reverse order, the most recent editions closer to the front, whilst the more yellowed and older entries were toward the back. The effect for the reader, therefore, was to travel back through the decades as they read. Not only was this a strange way to compose the book, but it also spoke, I thought, of some striking forethought on the part of whoever posted the first entry, beginning as they did with the anticipation that further entries, more stories relevant enough to be pasted in, would arise in the future. The first and most recent article was translated from a feature in a Chinese newspaper and recounted a tragic accident from a fighter kite show. Apparently, at such shows where professional kite makers race or display their creations and fight them with one another, it is common practice for the lines or strings of the kites to be lined with powdered glass to cut the strings of rivals. This makes what sounds like a genteel and innocuous pastime into a potentially dangerous activity, as contact with these taut, razor-sharp kite strings, pulled irretrievably by the force of strong winds, can have violent and tragic consequences. According to the article, numerous cases of people being seriously injured or even killed by such kites occur every year, and in the case recorded in this report, a young gentleman from Afghanistan, not participating in the show, had his throat cut by a glass-coated kite line. Gruesome as the story was, it was the opposing page, with its itemized receipt of items purchased by the unfortunate victim 1 month earlier, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Amongst the 6 items purchased from an antique dealer in Stone Town, Zanzibar, was an item listed as 19th century puppet, Mr. Strings. Below, a handwritten note explaining how the man, Mr. Afisan, had intended to display Mr. Strings in a puppetry museum, but did not get the chance. Again, I felt my eyes dragged from the page and over to the open drawer, the 2 heavy padlocks laid on the ground before it. From my vantage point, all that could be seen was the open drawer, and yet somehow, knowing that behind the worn green paint, that tiny form lay like the body of a child, made my skin crawl. I wished that the old man would close the drawer, reapply the padlocks, and keep him in there. Every time I shifted my eyes back to the pages, I felt other eyes, tiny, cold and blue, glaring out from the drawer toward me. I considered for a moment what I might do if, from the corner of my eye, I were to see Mr. Strings sit up, straight-backed, and watch the tiny head turn slowly towards me. I swallowed hard. The soft rustle as I turned the page, stiff with old newsprint and paste, sounding massive in the unbroken hush of the basement room. Around me, the assortment of junk and jewellery, cast-offs and curios, seemed again to lean in, huddling conspiratorially around me in a dark, closed circle, woven lace basketry of angles and shadows, shrinking ever inward and watching as I read. I shifted in my seat and felt the sudden urge to tug at my collar, to loosen its constrictive grip around my throat, and to get some air. I flipped through more stories. The story of another buyer, a young Californian man who had purchased the puppet intending to use Mr. Strings as a prop in an episode of a horror anthology movie, tying the gruesome history I was only now exploring to a new and fictional narrative in the hope of boosting interest in the production. I read the correspondence between the seller and this man, explaining how Mr. Strings would be perfect for his purposes. Then I read about his death. A separate article from 2 months later explained how the young man had been in a skydiving accident. Whilst his parachute had opened as planned, He had been blown severely off course and had come down in the middle of a lake, the parachute's nylon fabric folding over him as he entered the water, spreading across the surface and preventing him from coming up for air, trapping him below as the ropes and strings tangled around his limbs as he flailed and attempted to swim, to find the surface and the oxygen he needed. Instead, he drowned. Desperate now to find the beginning of this tale, to see the origin of these awful happenings, I skipped toward the back, my attention arrested by a drawing on yellowed paper of 6 men, members of an Armenian puppet theatre that had featured Mr. Strings as a character. The drawing was used to illustrate a story about a bizarre suicide pact in which all 6 men had hanged themselves at the same time from an iron chandelier in the central hall of the venue they were to play later that night. The drawing showed the chandelier and the 6 bodies hanging from the ends, each for their nooses creating what looked like a horrific mobile or ceiling decoration, each of the 6 bodies dangling by a string. I looked over at the old man, whose eyes were fixed on me, quietly noting my reactions to each lurid story. Finally, I turned to the back page of the book. On one side was a handwritten letter, on the other a series of photographs. Taken together, these 2 pages made my blood run cold. The letter, dated the 22nd of December 1891, was written by a Mr. Jean Eclus, whom I would learn through later research was a renowned spice merchant. In it, he explained how 6 years earlier, Mr. Wilhelm Strenger had been responsible for the death of Eclus' brother. Mr. Strenger, it would seem, was the owner and proprietor of an establishment that provided a 2-penny hangover to the homeless and drunk of London's underclass. This implausible arrangement provided a long rope like a washing line, over which, for the price of 2 pennies, a drunk or destitute could hang as a way of sleeping, doubled and folded over the tight string, but held semi-upright by its length. They were not allowed to lie down on the floor, but for a few more pennies could pay for a bench at which they could lean over another rope. This appalling setup, which folk etymology would have us believe was the origin of the term hangover, was common in Victorian England and Ireland, and the particular establishment operated by Strenger was the last place visited by Eclus' brother, who, in the night, somehow managed to slip and get his neck caught in the rope, so that he ended up seated with the rope around his throat and was very slowly strangled to death. Whilst this could have been written off as an unfortunate accident, what followed was even more distasteful, as Strenger, with the help of his hired hands, stripped the body, sold the shoes, overcoat and cap to another patron, and finally pitched the body into the Thames River. It took Eclus 2 days of questioning and bribes to discover the fate of his less fortunate brother and the individual responsible. It took him 8 years to find someone who could help him to put his plan for vengeance into action. In October of 1890, on a ship returning from South America, was a man who had enlisted for the voyage, possessing the skills that Eclus required. In the letter, he speaks in a very matter-of-fact way of having personally followed and indeed hunted Strenger and unceremoniously slit his throat. Why he did not do this in the days, weeks, and early years after his brother's death owed to his plans for Mr. Strenger's mortal remains. The man, who arrived from South America, had first known about the practice of head shrinking, the ritual preservation of a vanquished enemy by pickling and shrinking the victim's head and retaining it as a trophy. I had seen examples of such shrunken heads in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and several dubious examples in various places in the United States. Eclus' plans, however, differed somewhat from tradition. Whereas the usual process was to remove the skin of the face and scalp from the cranium, scrape away the fat and wrap the leather around a wooden ball, before the shrinkage took place, Eclus' desire was for the entire body, intact and complete, to be shrunk down to 1/8 of its size. Only when he was sure that his mysterious friend was able to help him in this task did Eclus exact revenge, and over the next 18 months undertook the various preparations, treatments and processes necessary to shrink the body down. Once this was achieved, the separate parts were severed from the joints and then attached to wires. All of which is to say that Mr. Strings was never carved. His lifelike detail was never the work of any artist. Wilhelm Strenger became Mr. Strings. On the opposing page was a photograph of the puppet's left foot. Unseen by me as a result of it being encased in a tiny leather shoe, the photograph showed how the foot appeared when exposed, the skin having been stripped away to demonstrate what lay beneath, a tiny, shrunken skeleton. I observed the minuscule structure of the foot, the minute bones of each toe, and the top of the foot. I felt my stomach flip and roll within me, and allowed my eyes to again fall on the open drawer, to trace the flaked green paint, the weathered ancient wood, and the black space above, and as I did, I felt my throat tighten. For halfway along the top of the drawer, perhaps 2 inches in length, glimmering with the oily sheen of tanned brown leather, 4 tiny and perfect fingers curled around the wood. I threw the book from me, scrabbling in a fit of panic, the chair clattering to the ground beneath me as I rose and sprinted toward the stairs, my feet feeling entirely detached from my legs, which seemed to have liquefied, freewheeling against the stone edges as I ran, grasped and fled up the stairs, through the shop and out into the street. A few days later, I shared my experience, unedited and as truthfully as I could, with one of the financial backers of the exhibit. Having discussed the matter with the other 3 backers, he expressed sympathy for my experience, but underlined the fact that I should make it my top priority to acquire the puppet for the exhibition, no matter the cost. At this point, I am sorry to say, my superstitions got the better of me, and despite my commitments, despite my years of collecting and the financial investment I had put into the show, I refused and withdrew myself from the project. I did not in any way want my name associated with the purchase of that doll. A few weeks later, I read that the curio shop where I had met Mr. Strings had closed. The owner hanged himself in the basement. The items in the shop were sold off by the family at auction, the catalogue for which I acquired, though there was no listing for a puppet or any item with the name Mr. Strings. When I contacted my former partners to inform them of this and to ask whether they knew anything about where the puppet may have ended up, they were reluctant to answer, repeating only that since our business relationship had come to an end at such an inconvenient juncture, it was not appropriate for them to discuss which items they may and may not have acquired or at what point in time. The exhibition is set to open in a fortnight. Having worked on its composition for so long, I am fully aware that in the 3rd room, the main hall, there will be a large cast-iron chandelier hanging over the room. The chandelier has 4 solid branches and will hang around 15 feet above the floor. I am hopeful that it will be the only thing that will be strung up in that room, but I am, I admit, far from sure. Clown Eater. Some people are scared of clowns. It's a real phobia. I read once that it's something about their smiles. The painted grins are just a little too wide, and whatever it is in our heads that recognizes faces gets twitchy. It isn't wired to see a smile or a mouth that wide without instantly thinking of teeth, seeing the threat of a mouth that wide as something with a potential to bite or even to consume. Of course that's ridiculous. Most of the time. I'm not scared of clowns. I've worked with enough of them, metaphorically at least, to have developed an immunity. The only literal clown I ever worked with wasn't frightening either. But the thing that scared him, the thing that clowns are scared of, well, that I am scared of too. It's the reason I no longer do what I did, and why my hair stands on end at the tinkling sound of bells. Of course, there had always been strange ones. In my line of work, you get to meet some truly eccentric people who keep the strangest hours, display the strangest habits, and generally spend much of their time out of step with the rest of the world. I guess, in some cases, that's why they need protection in the first place. I've honestly lost count of the times that I've obediently looked the other way, stoically silent, whilst God knows what went on just meters away. I could fill entire shelves of books with stories like that, but then that just isn't done. Keeping your mouth shut, being as much a pillar for the client as the stone ones that hold up the rooms in which they do what they do, is all part of working in security. Bodyguards don't just protect people physically, they protect their secrets as well. Almost daily I'd be approached by guys from the newspapers who wanted to hear the salacious details about this or that celebrity. Sometimes they'd have something specific in mind, the scent of a story, or some fragmentary detail from which they hoped to build a story. Other times they had nothing and would just be fishing for gossip, trying to work out what fictions they could weave from the crumbs you might give them. In all cases, short shrift was the best approach. I was in my first year on the job when I learned that. A colleague of mine, a veteran bodyguard by the name of Cliff Hanlon, gave me some solid advice. Good reporters, he said, would follow the breadcrumbs and eventually find the witch's house. Bad reporters would take the few breadcrumbs you give them and make a trail of their own, with an entire gingerbread house of their invention at the end of it. If they come to you and ask you anything, say nothing. When they come sniffing for breadcrumbs, there's only one approach that works. Leave them to starve. I suppose it's a more roundabout way of saying silence is golden. But the image stuck with me, and in my 30 years on the job, it's the best piece of advice I ever received. Whenever I was asked about a client, I gave the same answer: a fixed glare and stony silence. This is why, for some, it may seem strange that I have chosen to talk about these things now. That without being asked, coerced, or blackmailed, I've decided to give away, unsolicited, and with no prospect of payment from one of those lurid red-top tabloids that hounded me all those years, everything. For those who know me well, and those are few and far between, it won't seem so strange. I'm telling what I know for two reasons. Firstly, because it's the right thing to do, and secondly, because in 30 years in security, 30 years in which I've had countless hair-raising encounters, it was the only time that I was ever really scared. When I first heard about the job, I expected it to start like every other, with the 4 keys. The 4 pieces of information that any half-decent bodyguard needs at the outset of a new assignment. When, where, who, and who from. When dignitaries, government officials, or certain celebrities were involved, those questions could be a big deal, especially when and where. Planning sometimes took place weeks or even months before, with every last detail and spare second of the day mapped out and scheduled in advance, with careful attention to the client's budget, notoriety, and of course the size of threat against them. The movements of the client around which this story centers were planned weeks ahead of time, with everything from the guy's lunch menus to the duration of his toilet breaks, for which I was delighted to discover I was required to be present, worked out with a clockmaker's precision well in advance. I knew what I would be doing almost every moment of every day for the first 2 months, with a promise that the job might last far longer than that if the threat level was deemed to still be high. This, however, was not enough. Whilst it was true that my movements had been laid out meticulously, I was unhappy with the things I had not been told. The 2 pieces of information that I considered to be of the greatest importance. Who exactly I was protecting, and more importantly still, who was I supposed to be protecting them from? I got the first piece of information the night before the job commenced. I was to be guarding Almo the Clown. At first I thought that the supervisor was joking, but the hollow look in the man's eyes convinced me immediately that it was true. My new job was protecting a clown. Not that Almo ever made an appearance whilst I was around. During our time together he was decidedly off-duty, and as far as I'm aware had already resigned himself to never playing the role of Almo again. When out of character and portraying only himself, it was sometimes hard to imagine that this guy could ever have been a clown. He just didn't seem the type to don the makeup and loud clothes or to fall around to amuse children. Without the makeup, Almat Beyran, which was the client's real name for those noting down these breadcrumbs, was a quiet, intelligent, and thoughtful man. Not what I'd expected from a clown. Compared with some people I've been charged with looking after over the years, he was a delight, and at the end of the first day of our acquaintance, I found myself sitting outside his hotel room door in a cheap armchair brought up for the purpose, reasoning that this could be quite an easy gig. That first night, it was. Early the next morning, Almat took breakfast with one of my relief workers and an additional hotel security guard whilst I caught up some sleep. That afternoon, I was informed that changes had been made to the schedule and that in 2 days I would be making somewhat of a strange visit with Almat. I must admit that even at the time, not knowing what I know now, I still thought it was odd. I'm sure that a lot of the people hearing these words will be unaware that a clown museum is even a thing that exists in real life. But trust me, it does. I had certainly never heard of it, and once again, when the details of the visit were given to me, I initially thought it was a joke. As it turned out, and as a quick search on Google confirmed, the Clown Museum in Somerset is very real. Not only that, but it is split over 2 separate sites. Primarily intended to house a collection of memorabilia and paraphernalia relating to the art of clowning, the museum is home to many items that date back hundreds of years, and indeed has a few exceedingly rare and valuable pieces. More importantly, however, it has eggs. As Almat reliably informed me later that day, the Clown Museum was also home to the International Clown Registry, where each performer not only makes a record of his performance name and intention to be a clown, but crucially shares the design of his makeup. It had long been a tradition that no 2 clowns were allowed to wear the same face paint design, and indeed some performers were highly protective of the details of their particular look, believing that the idiosyncrasies of the design distinguished them from other acts. To collect these designs and to avoid duplication by displaying them for all to see, each clown that registers is required to paint their face with their distinctive makeup design onto a hard-boiled egg. That egg is then placed alongside the others in a huge display case that dates back over 100 years and showcases the designs of many famous acts. In the past, the designs were painted onto genuine hard-boiled chicken eggs. Nowadays, they are printed or painted onto ceramic imitations. The reason for the switch was partially due to Almat. He explained the details of the museum in the early evening of that second day. He had been sitting by the window in his hotel room whilst I made a coffee and prepared for another night's shift out in the corridor, perched in the chair by the door, when he had suddenly decided entirely unprompted to tell me why I was there. This began with an explanation of the Clown Museum and a deadly insistence that clowning was a noble pursuit, and that those within the fraternity, which he described with the same reverence that magicians talk about the magic circle, took very seriously. I had nodded, straight-lipped at this, for, as absurd as it sounded, I could tell that Almat meant it. He told me about his registration and how his makeup design was a combination of elements worn by his father and uncle, both of whom were no longer living, but whose boiled egg records were themselves on display at the museum. Then, with little warning, he began to cry. At first, I said nothing, thinking that the impromptu shredding of tears was somehow linked to this mention of his dead relatives, but after watching him for a few moments, seeing his shoulder rise and fall as he sobbed, I noticed that he was trembling. Struggling to regain his composure, he beckoned me to take a seat by the window opposite him, which I silently did. The sun was sinking by this point, and in its final shrinking rays, as they glanced struggled through the glass, Almat looked far older than he had the previous day. The lines of his face seemed to have been weathered by his sobs, as if the tears themselves had washed away a surface layer of years. He at once looked old and, more strikingly, terrified. From the satchel by his feet, he produced a small, tattered-looking scrapbook, which he opened before me on the table as he coughed, clearing his throat and attempting to compose himself. "When I was young," he began, "my uncle would tell me about Sakhaja. Growing up, I thought it was something that he had invented. It was only years later, when I registered as a clown and began corresponding with others around the world, that I realized how deep the idea went. It wasn't just my uncle or my father, or me. Everyone knows Sakhaja, or at least every clown does. If you say the word in front of a clown, they go suddenly quiet. Saying it at a circus is reason enough not to perform that night, like saying Macbeth in a theatre. Sakhaja is our bogeyman, made just for clowns, a myth or a spooky story that only we know in our weird little group. There are different versions, yeah, and sometimes the details change, but some things are always the same, and every clown that has ever smeared on grease paint has at least once looked over his shoulder in case Sakhaja is waiting." I said nothing and stared hard at Almat. If he was unstable, then this gig was going to be a lot harder than I thought. Undeterred by my non-committal silence, he leaned forward and opened the book. Inside, on the first page, there was a photograph of what looked to me like a fresco painted on some old wall, which Almat clarified was exactly what it was. The image itself was of a hideous thing. From the neck down, it had the body of a large, muscular but hunchbacked man, dressed like a harlequin or a jester, in the blue and yellow suit that stretched from the toes to the throat. Here, however, split from the body by something like the ruff you saw on kings and queens from the Renaissance, was a sprouting, tangled clutch of 8 hideous heads. The necks upon which these faces sat bled together, a browned tangle of swollen muscles, veins and sinews, whilst each wretched head wore a jester's 3-point hat adorned with tiny bells. Each face, meanwhile, coloured the off-blue brown of rotted fruit, grinned hungrily, displaying to the onlooker row upon row of shark-like teeth. "This," Almat said, pointing at the photograph, "is Sakhaja. In my uncle's story, he was the devil's fool, a jester to the king's court in hell. In other stories, he's a thing made up of several jinns who were trapped together in a jar and eventually melded together. In northern France, it's the spirits of clowns that were cruel to children or who did wicked things to disgrace the trade." Almat flipped the page and ran his finger slowly over the image. For a second, I thought it was the same image, but a closer look revealed it to be altered and changed. It was the same painting, but now the jutting fangs were covered by the jolly paint of a clown. Each of the thing's heads was painted with a different design. One was black and white, with upturned triangles like angular tears beneath the eyes. Another a mess of blues and reds, with a cross painted over the eyes and a crimson slash for a mouth. Yet another had swathes of yellow in the ridges where the eyebrows meet the nose. Again, Almat prodded at the image. The first photo is of a painting on a wall from the old theatre in St. Vitus's Square. He's the patron saint of entertainers. The photo was taken in 1911, but the painting is centuries old. The second image is the same painting in 1921. "They changed it?" I asked, admittedly somewhat intrigued by Almat's kooky story. Almat didn't answer or even nod, but instead simply flipped the page. The next page featured the images of 8 men, all in full clown makeup. It took me less than a second to recognize some of the designs. The yellow crescent on the eyebrows, the black upturned triangles, the designs were the same. "It feeds on them and wears their makeup. Maybe it was meant as a way to discourage people from stealing each other's designs, but..." He gripped the back of his neck with the palm of his hand. "In 1920, every one of these men disappeared. They were never seen again. Other photographs show the painting changing gradually, each face one by one suddenly becoming painted. It's a horror story that clowns share, There was even going to be a display about it at the Clown Museum, but... He trailed off, pouring now at his eyes in an attempt to wipe away the tears. I lifted the book from him and began flipping through the pages. The sequence was always the same. A painting of this thing, firstly with the 8 hideous grins and dagger-like teeth, then a second photograph with the faces painted over with the gaudy designs of a clown's makeup. On the following page, there was always a collection of photographs, men in various poses, wearing their clown costumes. As I flipped the pages, the volume of material in each sequence increased. News reports were now included, clippings about men having gone missing, often with no mention of them having been a clown. As the amount of information increased, I realized that I was flipping through the decades. The first entry had been 1920, the next 1940, and so on every 20 years up to the present. In recent decades, with the advent of the internet and the increased speed with which ideas and information could be transferred, the number of entries increased greatly. Now there was even a smattering of rumours and reports about the legend itself. Former clowns who had written reports about it, folklorists researching the shared superstitions of closed groups had written papers about it, and at every 20-year milestone, photographs of men who had disappeared. I flipped back to the first photograph, to the thing sans makeup, the brown, leathery skin of its face stretched across ill-sized bones and the teeth like a badly taxidermized reptile. I closed the book and handed it back to Almat. Thing is, over the past year, 7 men who are registered clowns have gone missing, all of them living in Britain. After the 3rd man went missing, we contacted the police with this story, trying to get them to see the link, the fact that these men shared a profession, and that it was this detail that should be pursued, but they wouldn't listen. The men were missing, not dead. They were registered as missing persons, but they were not investigating any link between the disappearances in different parts of the British Isles, especially not one that suggested they might have been... Almat's head sank again. Eaten? I finished for him, as he nodded deeply and held out for me a photograph on his phone. It showed the egg register of clown makeup from the museum. There were 7 smashed eggs. The next egg in sequence, the last in the display, was untouched. It did not take a genius to work out who that design belonged to. That night, I again took up my post in the corridor as Almat slept. I got myself settled with a coffee I had ordered earlier and, sighing deeply, prepared for what was undoubtedly going to be a long night. One of the downsides to this line of work, some might say the biggest, is the boredom. There isn't much to stimulate the mind sitting in the empty corridor of a hotel. Pale beige walls, vapid and inoffensive paintings of orchids, a thick red carpet that stretched away like a long streak of blood off to the end and around the blind corner of the next corridor, and of course, the quiet. Save for the initial shuffling of Almat in his room as he prepared for bed, the corridor was silent, and since he finally succumbed to sleep, there had not been a sound on this floor. The hush should not have been creepy. It wasn't like I was in the dark. In fact, far from it. The entire length of the hallway was lit with horrible overhead lights. Nor was it as if I were sitting in some creepy run-down motel or the dank of some haunted house. Yet, there was something not quite right. I have always felt there was something desolate about the artificiality of hotels, particularly the hallways. The standardized and sanitized colors and ornaments, the enforced uniformity, always seemed to me to be somehow unnatural, inhuman. The removal of any idiosyncrasy was worse in the big chains, and in the later hours when nothing stirred, the halls seemed remarkably, almost nakedly empty. But this one wasn't. It was around 4 a.m. I had admittedly begun to nod a little, an admission I would not be making had I not retired a few years ago. My head had just begun to sink, my eyes to close heavily, when I was disturbed by a sound. A soft, cushioned thud, as of something heavy landing on a quilted surface, and with it, the distant jingle of tiny bells. It was the same soft jingle that you can't escape at Christmas. It seems to appear on every Christmas song, meant, I think, to imitate sleigh bells. It was as if, somewhere around the corner at the end of the corridor, someone was lightly tapping a tambourine at regular intervals, whilst thumping the ground with a weight or club. There would be a pause, a long stretch of silence, then the soft, dissonant jangle as of a group of bells in perfect time with the thud. I tried to think what manner of thing would make that sound, searched my mind for any suggestion other than the one that pressed itself most urgently forward, but my thought was interrupted by another, clearer, closer thud. One thing I did know, simply from the force of the impact, was that whatever was making that sound, it was big. I stared blankly down the corridor, following that long red streak of carpet past pine-coloured doors, markers of space between me and the sound, and thought about beginning to move slowly along them. I sat upright in the chair, now suddenly awake, and watched the bend where this corridor met the next, a blind corner around which something was making that noise, and, judging by the volume, slowly but surely getting closer. I rose, quietly and cautiously from my chair, never taking my eyes off the end of the hall, and realized for the first time in my longer career that I was scared. I admonished myself, even going so far as to physically shake my head. They're stories, I told myself. Stupid little myths were created by a group to stop people from stealing other people's designs. Yet, with each soft thud, each tiny jingle of the bells like those, I knew, that hung at the tip of a jester's hat, I felt the hair rise on my arms and my neck. As the image of some hulking thing hunched forward as the weight of its many heads pulled it, lurching onward, clown makeup smeared across some faces whilst the others, unadorned, sported that leathery brown skin and huge pointed teeth. Moving as silently as possible and with a final glance back at the door I was guarding, I began very slowly to pace toward the end of the corridor, toward the hard left bend and the next stretch in which, I believed, whatever was making the sound was lurking. As I approached the blind bend, I paused, and for the first time in over a decade, unclipped the holster of my gun. As I did, however, an image stopped me. Across to my right was a painting, a bog-standard, nondescript daubing of lilacs or some other inoffensive plant. The framed painting was hanging at the furthest end of my corridor, facing straight down the next, the one that waited for me, around the sharp corner. At first glance I wished that this painting was itself a mirror, and realized that, of course, the glass of the frame would provide something of a glimpse, a blurred, indistinct, but at least partial view of the entire corridor. Even as these thoughts crossed my mind, however, I caught sight of what was reflected in the glass. I saw the long red expanse of carpet, the beige uniform rows of pine doors, and the thing staring directly back with 8 pairs of eyes. The vision lasted less than a moment, after which I had turned away, sprinted towards Almat's room, and in a matter of seconds had flung the door open, bundled him, still in his underwear, out of bed and down the fire escape as I called for a support car to meet us in the street below. Once in the car, panting, and I am not ashamed to admit, shaking in every part of my body, I handed the spare clothes we always stored for such situations to Almat and told the driver to head onto the motorway toward the Clown Museum. No way was I waiting 2 weeks. This needed fixing, and fixing now. Driving through what remained of the night, we arrived at the museum extremely early the next morning, an aggressive and demanding phone call from yours truly having summoned the curator out of bed to open up for us. We made only one stop on the way there, at a 24-hour supermarket where I had the driver buy 2 dishcloths and a bottle of white spirit. He complained of the looks the cashier would give him for buying near pure alcohol at 6 a.m, but he did as he was asked anyway. Having been let into the museum itself, Almat explained his situation and, with the help of the scrapbook, succeeded in at least partially scaring the life out of the curator. He also explained his wish to cancel his registration as a clown. Whilst the curator drew up some document for Almat to sign to this effect, no such document of the kind had existed up until that point, I was led with Almat to the egg register. Seeing the lines of painted faces, their two wide smiles and dead, expressionless eyes all staring blankly forward at the same time, again brought a chill to my bones, as for a moment the fleeting image of what I thought I had seen in the corridor resurfaced and, in particular, the detail of 7 faces already painted. Using the white spirit and the rag, Almat, under my instruction and somewhat reluctantly, wiped the paint from his egg. The design he had registered as his own, to be used only by Almo the clown, dissolved into a milky residue of white and blue. Looking back at me, he asked if I thought this would work. I shrugged. Thieves can't steal when there is nothing left to take, concluding that the best we could do was hope. As it turned out, this approach did seem effective. Almat is still alive and well, though he never again donned the makeup nor participated in any activity that could be construed as clowning. Almo the clown was no longer registered and could be considered either dead or retired. I prefer to think of him as the latter. As for me, I also retired not a fortnight after that night. I have often thought back to what I thought I saw that night. Tried to convince myself that perhaps it was just a suggestion, that fatigue, suggestibility, and perhaps a desire to be out of the job once and for all, combined to conjure from my imagination something that should and indeed could never exist in reality. After all, it was only a fleeting glance. For a while, I almost convinced myself. Then the clowns started to turn up. Over 9 months last year, all 7 of the men who had been reported missing were found, or rather, their bodies were, in whatever form they still existed. Details released to the press were sketchy, though from what I was told by a colleague with an inside connection, in every case the skin of the face had been removed and some part of the body, a limb, a foot or a hand, sometimes the entire lower portion, legs and all, was missing. There was never any mention of them all having been clowns. 5 of the murders were claimed by and indeed quietly attributed to an inmate currently being detained at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, and for a while, tragic as it is, this news gave me some comfort. At least, I thought, the killings could be attributed to a human agency rather than any supernatural phenomenon, and to someone who is in custody and therefore no longer a threat. However, a few incidents in the past couple of weeks changed that view. The first was an encounter with a friend who works for the Metropolitan Police Department, who, after a few drinks, explained to me the practice of black drawing. This process, he explained, involved pinning murders or other crimes that the department would like to go away on people who were incapacitated mentally and who would willingly take the blame. Though not a common occurrence and certainly not something that would ever become official policy, cases that would expose incompetence or malpractice and disgrace the service nevertheless had a habit of being swallowed by inmates at Broadmoor and other psychiatric facilities housing dangerous criminals. Disturbed minds, all too happy, or at least quietly willing, to accept the blame and tie up those annoying loose ends. This idea gnawed at me. Was it possible? Certainly, it would be greatly embarrassing for the department if it were ever made public that the police missed the connection between these men, that they overlooked something as glaringly obvious as the fact that they were all registered clowns and were killed in the order that they registered. That, had the connection been made after the second death, the other 5 could have been protected. Such a revelation would show the department in an unbelievably bad light indeed. Pity that. For although the idea seems far-fetched, it did to me up until a few days ago. I am now convinced that this is the case, and I don't mind telling you why. A few days ago, I was searching through the invoices of the security company I worked for and, out of pure curiosity, looked back to see exactly who it was that had engaged our services to look after Almat. I always knew it wasn't the man himself, but had never been clear on exactly who had enough of an interest in keeping Almat alive to pay for a full-time bodyguard. I had to read the listed name 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. It seems the Metropolitan Police Department were very keen to ensure that 7 did not become 8. That they were aware of the link between these men, I have no doubt. Whether they knew what was causing the disappearances, I do not know, though it does seem odd that the police would hire an outside agency to handle protection, almost as if they were unwilling to put any of their own in harm's way, or in the path of something that batons and bullets might not stop. As for me, I have reached the conclusion that whatever it was I saw that night was real. The idea that they knew all along makes me angry, but does nothing to comfort me or help me reconcile what I saw with my beliefs about the nature of reality and what should and should not be real. All I can say is that I now tend to go abroad around Christmas to a country that doesn't celebrate it and where I don't have to hear the jangling of tiny bells. I have explained the events as I understand them here, in the hope that one of the good journalists might follow the breadcrumbs and find a gingerbread house. Though I must admit that even that idea scares me, for I fear that if they do, they will find something far worse than a fairy tale that is prowling the darkness inside. Graveyard Rising. Tyler Street looked as though it hadn't changed a bit since the last time Byron had been there. Same sidewalk cafe, same trendy woman's clothing store across the street, same classy jazz club next door to that. It had been a year since he'd been there, and everything was perfectly in place. Stepping past the jazz club and clothing store, he heard a high-pitched whimper in the background, rising above the traffic's din. It sounded wounded, almost angry, like a dying goose. Checking the faces of other pedestrians, he wondered why nobody else seemed to notice the sound. They all kept walking, faces casual. Nobody was curious about that tortured wail. Byron shrugged it off, figuring he was just imagining it. Maybe he was distracted by the grim mission that lay ahead of him. He took a seat at the sidewalk cafe, checking the time and rehearsing words in his head he'd already repeated more times than he cared to recall. It's not you, it's me. I just don't think I'm prepared to provide everything a strong, dynamic young woman like yourself deserves. And let's be clear about one thing. You are the best, and you deserve the best. In fact, you deserve better than me, much, much better than me. The waiter stepped up with a forced grin, a pad of paper and pencil ready. Hello, my name is Marco, Byron called. Good to see you again. Marco tilted his head, eyes narrow. Yeah, Byron, right? Remind me where I know you from? I'm a regular, dude. Well, semi-regular. I'm the guy who was here a year ago with a pretty redhead, then a month before that with a hot blonde. In fact, I think I made a total of 6 trips here in the last 2 years, and always with the same purpose in mind. Tell me about it, Marco said. Not to brag, but this is a surprisingly good place to score some points with your lady, am I right? Well, not exactly. I mean, I'm sure it can serve that purpose, but for me it always serves another purpose. What's that? Byron leaned in closer, kept his voice low. Let's put it this way. I call this place the girlfriend graveyard. Huh? You see, the way I figure it, if you're going to dump a girl, you want to take her someplace classy and quiet. That way she won't get loud and dramatic on you. Good move, dude. And on top of that, you got those cool places across the street. Clothing store where she can distract herself by shopping for new shoes or a skirt or whatever girls buy in there. And cool little jazz club where she can listen to some soothing music to calm herself down too. Marco nodded. I should try it myself someday. I'm telling you, works every time, Byron said. Although I did have this close call once with Molly when she... He stopped himself before Emily stepped around the corner, all grins and the long black hair. "Hey, honey." After a discreet nod to the waiter, Byron leaned back in his chair, pasting a phony smile on his face and preparing his speech as his girlfriend eased into her seat. His date ordered a green tea and avocado salad. He went with a bacon cheeseburger. As Marco retreated from the table, Byron mouthed the words, "Wish me luck," while Emily couldn't see him. The waiter replied with a wink, then left. "Hey there, pretty lady. That smile for me?" "Always." "So, what did you have planned? You told me it was really urgent we get together today. I figured you must have a surprise for me. Was I right?" Byron felt a tug from his conscience. He frowned, then took her by the hand. "Here's the thing, Emily." The smile melted from her face as the words came out, assaulting her one by one. She looked away, face tightening, eyes getting red and wet, but she didn't cry. This was, after all, a quiet and classy cafe. Sobbing in a place like this would just seem in bad taste. "I'm sorry," he said, her tiny hand now shaking, but still clinging to his. "Are you going to be okay?" Emily looked up at him, swallowing hard. For a split second, her eyes found the clothing store across the street. He could see her spirits lift a little. The smile was on its way back. "Yeah, I think so." Marco approached with their meals, gently placing the plates on the table before stepping back. He didn't have to wonder what the awkward silence was about. Emily looked down at her plate, her gaze empty. "You know, I don't think I have much of an appetite anymore. I'm sorry." She raced off to the clothing store without another word. As he stared at the food, it occurred to Byron that he should have saved the speech until after they'd eaten. Now he's left a green tea and avocado salad he didn't want to eat and had already ordered. It was a rookie mistake. He chalked it up to his being a little rusty. It had, after all, been a whole year since he'd sent somebody to the girlfriend's graveyard. He took one more glance at Emily as she trudged inside the store. It was almost enough to make him sad, but not quite. He turned back and saw Marco approach, offering a discreet fist bump. "Mission accomplished, huh?" the waiter asked. "Kind of," Byron said, nodding toward the untouched salad and tea. "Sorry, no returns on food once it's been ordered." "No worries. I am curious about something, though." "What's that?" "That weird noise coming from across the street. That scream. That hasn't hurt business or anything, has it? You'd think something that loud would..." Marco's face was twisted. "What noise?" Byron laughed. This had to be a joke. "Seriously, I can't be the only one who hears that, can I?" Marco slowly backed away as if unsure of his customer's sanity. No more bro bonding. He was scared now. "You want a doggy bag for that?" he asked, gaze aimed at the table like he was afraid to make eye contact. At home, Byron could still hear the wail. It was quieter now, less urgent, but it was still there, and it wasn't going anywhere. He figured it would fade away in time, just disappear into the backdrop of life. But he was wrong. Playing his music at top volume did nothing to mask it. The wail only blended in with it, weaving its horror in and out of the song's melody like a haunting background vocalist. Exercise didn't help, or Netflix, or late-night phone calls. Once bedtime arrived, he was a mess, sweating, shaking, gobbling down sleeping pill after sleeping pill in an effort to escape. After too many minutes of pacing and counting sheep, he managed, somehow, to get to sleep. But the wail was right there, waiting for him. It knifed through his dream world, reminding him that no matter how pleasant the landscape, he still was who he was. He was still the guy with a history of abandoning girlfriend after girlfriend like outgrown shoes, and he would have to pay for his sins. He sprang out of bed, face drenched with sweat. By now the voice wasn't just there, it was recognizable. This voice belonged to Sarah. Sarah was an adorable redhead who liked yoga and weird new agey stuff Byron never understood or cared about. She was a lovable oddball at first, with her waist-length hair and peace-signed tattooed belly. She read him his tarot cards at breakfast and conducted seances at night that seemed so funny and cute, especially when she did them naked. But in time, the oddball became less lovable. They argued over stupid things like whether his furniture violated the room's feng shui or his choice to eat meat. Within a month of their meeting, it was time for Sarah to be sent to the girlfriend graveyard. Once the recognition of the voice hit him, it grew louder, angrier, as if responding to his awareness. "I love you!" it seemed to scream, piercing his eardrum like a stiletto. This was enough to send him to his feet, pacing through his room, frantic. But then something else occurred to him. She wasn't saying love. She was saying loved. Past tense. That creeped him out even more, raised the hair on his arms. Nothing to do but bury his head under the pillow, screaming to drown it out. But that only turned the voice into laughter, mocking him for thinking he could smother it out of existence. He lifted his head and thought about something she'd said to him. She'd said something about how recently departed souls who were in torment often made loud noises in the night, torturing those who sent them to the grave. Byron knew this made no sense. He didn't believe any of it. This had to be his own imagination concocting the voice. After all, nobody heard but him. And besides, Sarah was alive and well. Wasn't she? He wasn't so sure. Keeping in touch with past girlfriends was something he'd always promised to do, but never did. There was no point. Once he was done with them, he'd gotten everything he needed. Things could only get messy from there anyway. Better to make a clean break. So he had no idea if Sarah was still around. Only one way to find out. Springing to the other side of the bedroom, he dug into the pants pocket of last night's jeans. With shaky hands, he scooped out the cell phone, dialed, and waited, his breath heavy and body trembling. It took 5 rings to get an answer. "Yeah?" said the voice, half asleep, drained. But it was Sarah. Byron released a sigh that nearly hurt his lungs. Thank God. After a pause, she said, "Byron? What the hell are you doing calling me at 2 a.m? "Long story, we'll talk later," he said. "I just needed to know you were still alive." "What?" "Like I said, long story, but, you're still alive, right? I'm not talking to a ghost or something, am I?" Her voice woke up with a high-pitched cackle. "No, Byron, I'm still around despite your best efforts to destroy me." He forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess I wasn't the best boyfriend. Well, anyway, I'll let you get back to sleep now and—" "Yes, you could say that. You weren't the best boyfriend. In fact, I've never had a boyfriend who lied about his car, his dog, his job, then on top of that you dumped me 2 days after my cat died with some stupid line about how I didn't deserve you. Well, I was kind of right, wasn't I?" "Byron, you were wrong so much you don't even know how it felt to be right. But yeah, I didn't deserve you. Nobody does." "Okay, well, I'll let you go now." No, you're not getting rid of me that easy. Not like the first time." "Look, I understand you're a little upset, but I just called to make sure you were still alive." Another laugh. "Yes, I am. You may have crushed my soul, but you didn't destroy my body." She hung up. Byron sat there with the phone in his hand, waiting for the wail to go away. But it only got louder, carving deep inside his skull until his temples throbbed. This didn't make sense. If Sarah was still alive, there was no way her soul could be in torment. Then he remembered her words. You may have crushed my soul." Her soul was dead. It had somehow left her body after being dumped, and he needed to confront it or there would never be peace. He dialed again. Sarah answered with a groan. "What is it this time?" "How do you stop a soul from screaming for you?" "Oh my God, a soul is screaming for you?" He could hear her voice increase in urgency and her posture stiffen over the phone. "Yeah, it sounds like it's in pain." He imitated the soprano voice the best his baritone would allow. Sarah gasped and then said nothing for a while. "Come on, what should I do?" Another pause. She returned, voice sterner now, almost scared. "This is serious, and you need to get serious about the way you treat it." She took a deep breath, carefully considering her words. "You need to take something of the deceased to the graveyard, and you need to do this now." Byron thought for a while, wondering if it was a good idea to mention if the deceased wasn't deceased and that the deceased was her. He decided against it. That would only complicate things and give her reason to get emotional. Right now, he needed solutions, not more drama. "Hold on a second." He rifled through the closet, hoping to find something she'd left behind. "Byron, whatever you're doing, there's no time for it." Digging through the giant pile of clothes on his closet floor, he lifted everything he found, one item at a time. All his. Until he reached a pair of panties. Did you leave a pair of red silk panties in my house?" "This is no time for your perverted talk. You have to get to that graveyard fast." "Look, I just need to know because... And why are you still holding on to my panties a year after we split up anyway?" Byron didn't answer. He pumped a triumphant fist in the air and scrambled around for clothes. After clumsily throwing himself into a pair of tattered jeans and a mustard-stained 49ers jersey, he raced out of his home, the phone still cupped to his ear, red silk panties stuffed into his pocket. Once in his car, he rejoined the conversation as the ignition roared to life. "I'm going to need you to talk me through this, so please stay on the line." No reply. "You still there?" Through gritted teeth, Sarah grunted. "I swear to God, if I didn't think your life was in danger right now, I'd tell you to go straight to hell." "Thank you. Just shut up and listen carefully. Once you get to the graveyard, you're going to present the item and call the name of the deceased until they are with you." "How will I know when they're with me?" "Take my word for it. You'll know." "Then after that?" She took a deep breath, said, "Well, here's the thing," sounded like a parent about to tell her kid the truth about Santa Claus. "Yeah?" "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. It's not clear you're going to survive beyond that." "Are you telling me to do something dangerous?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Dangerous and necessary." The rest of the drive took place in uneasy silence. A stroll down memory lane would have only made things more awkward and intensified Sarah's rage. So, Byron drove down the street, eyes alertly wide, hands so sweaty it was a struggle to hold on to the steering wheel, breath coming out in panicked chops. He reached the graveyard about 10 minutes faster than he would have if he'd obeyed the speed limit. He screeched to a halt in front of the clothing store, panties poised in his hand like a pistol. Emerging from his car, one hand holding the phone to his ear, the other wielding the panties, he shut the door with his hip, quietly, as if afraid to wake a sleeping lioness. It was a small boutique, no more than 15 feet wide. 2 mannequins decorated the front window, the frames covered by long, multicolored floral print dresses. Everything behind that was obscured by a bright pink theatrical curtain. He inched forward and spoke into the phone, voice just above a whisper. "Okay, I'm here. What was the first thing to do again?" "Call the spirit up. You remember the name, don't you?" Of course. Pressing the speaker into his shoulder, he called Sarah's name, then waited. Nothing. He tried again, a little louder. Once again, nothing. The wail was still there, as strong and soaring as ever, but nothing else. He swallowed hard and tried again, this time screaming, "Sarah!" until his lungs ached. Bad move. The first thing that snagged Byron's attention was the shaking of the mannequins. Their dresses flapped as if under the sway of a gusty wind. Seconds later they tumbled to the floor. Then the glass shattered, forming a hole that sucked him inside, lifting him, tugging him, then tossing his lifeless body to the floor. The wail inside was nearly deafening. With his body wrapped in the curtain, he staggered to his feet, missing a step and crashing into a wall. After hitting the floor a second time, he lay there, shards of glass in his hair and mouth, arms full of Sarah's panties and the cell phone. He struggled to bring the receiver to the mouth, then spoke, breathless, frantic. "Okay, now what?" No answer. He realized Sarah couldn't hear him with the noise in the background. He repeated the question, screaming this time. She screamed her answer. "Wherever you are, get out of there now!" "But—" "No buts! Get out, while you can!" He reached, but slipped down, planting his face on the hardwood floor. After struggling, he found his feet, then tried to yank the curtain away. It took minutes, but he got himself free, pulling away and reaching toward freedom. The open window was 3, maybe 4 feet away, but he couldn't get there. The sucking force that carried him inside hauled his body away from the window. He felt his skin flapping hard, eyes forced shut. It was like one of those movie scenes of a fighter pilot dragged down by the persistent forces of gravity. After a violently hard yank, Byron was crushed against the rear wall, leaving him gasping for air and nursing his ribcage as he tried to scrape himself off the floor. But once again, he couldn't move. Instead, he saw an army of well-dressed mannequins inching toward him, their movements robotic and slow, and menacing. Meanwhile, the wail had intensified further. It was now no longer a single wail, but a chorus of them, 6 voices screeching together, each pitch in a different key and following a different rhythm, and Byron knew exactly who they were. Sarah was the leader. The high-pitched siren of her crushed soul had started things, but when he listened carefully, Byron could also hear Emily, Pam, Molly, and a few others whose names he'd forgotten. The mannequins rearranged themselves and circled around him, slowly closing in. The screeches were deafening now, carving into his ear canal and bringing a throb back to his temples. He could feel his legs buckle as the ground came up to meet him. He needed something, anything. A knife, a gun, something he could use to defend himself or at least distract his tormentors long enough for him to escape. Scanning the floor before him, he saw nothing useful. A wooden clothes hanger was the only thing in reach, while his cell phone and a ball of string lay just out of his grasp. He took a blow to his spine, pressing him further to the floor, face cold against the hardwood. Then came the sharp pokes from fingers and thumbs. The army of mannequins seemed determined to cut him open, even if their blunt digits couldn't do the job. This didn't stop them from trying. They jabbed, clipped, curled into his muscle, not penetrating flesh, but it was only a matter of time. Under the register, he spotted something shiny and long, a possible weapon. With no other options, he reached for it, clumsily pulled it back, and swung wildly, missing once, then twice. But the mannequins stopped, as if he'd not only hit them, but registered a deadly blow. No more movement. Byron's breath returned as he gawked upward, finding a collection of frozen faces, as motionless as their dull eyes were lifeless. Without warning, one of them came down on him, clanking hard against the back of his head. He braced himself for another onslaught, but it never came. This was just a mannequin toppling on the slippery floor. It lay on top of him, not moving. The wailing had stopped too. His ears kept ringing and the chorus of squeals continued to echo, but the original sources had died. He was free. Looking back, he spotted the origin of his freedom. When yanking the steel rod away, he'd accidentally pulled a power source from the socket. The thought sent a laugh through him. It seemed an appropriate end to the weirdest experience of his life. His first impulse was to climb to his feet, but before getting there, another eerie sound shrieked to life, this one static-laden and faint. With wide eyes, he swept the store's landscape, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. There was the mess he found himself in the middle of, his attackers, the balled-up curtain, his cell phone. That was it. The screams were coming from his cell phone. Byron reached forward and scooped his cell up, bringing it as close to his ear as he could without risking pain. Sarah? She was laughing now, lacing throaty howls between each scream. "Hello, Byron," she said. "I figured something's out in the last few minutes." "What's that, Sarah?" he said, his voice deeper now, cocky. And why not? The trauma was over. Nothing more to fear. "You didn't tell me my soul was the one in torment." Byron heaved himself off the floor and dusted off. "Well, doesn't matter now anyway, does it?" "I'm afraid it does." He started for the door. "What are you talking about? It's all over now." "Wrong!" she screamed. "Unleash hell." In perfect sync with Sarah's command, his body was sucked back against the wall, crashing hard against it and landing under the pile of mannequins. The wooden arms remained lifeless, but an odd sound emerged. Crackles. As they grew louder and louder, Byron breathlessly fought against the tug while scanning his surroundings. What the hell was making that sound? A glance at the mannequins answered the question. They were on fire, and he was underneath them. Although still lifeless, they now seemed to weigh a ton. Fighting the pull of gravity was a battle he couldn't win. He looked around, finding fire everywhere. The curtains were aflame along with the wooden hangers, and with one powerful whoosh, the floor. Flames shot from below, inches high at first, then growing to feet in seconds. He couldn't lift himself from the floor, but he could shift from place to place, keeping the intense heat from burning him too badly. With much effort, he reached the counter at his side, aiming to find the top. With a grunt, he got there, then wormed himself upright until a safe spot atop it was just one tug away. But he slipped, landing hard and bringing the hardwood floor to his knees and elbows. His body ached and felt drained, nothing left in his tank. He screamed into his cell phone. "Sarah, please, whatever you want from me, you got it." "You don't understand," she replied. "It's too late. What I wanted from you can never, ever be gained." "Why?" he called. No answer. He repeated the question until his voice was dry and empty. "I was wrong, I admit it. I just wanted your body, nothing else. I didn't care about you as a person, and I was wrong." The flames went out. So did the suction. Within seconds, the embers became ash. The only sound now was the smoke flickering to its death. "What did you just say?" she demanded. "What just happened here?" I don't know. I heard you say something weird. Or weird for you, at least." "What was that?" "You told me the truth. You were open, honest, vulnerable. You unburdened your soul. That must have done it." Byron slowly found his feet, moving as if testing the room's gravity, making sure he could move freely. He could. But this time, he didn't trust his surroundings right away. He stepped through the hole in the window and walked free, bringing his cell phone back to his ear. Sarah was still talking, going on and on, just like she used to. Listening to her, he shook his head, just like the old days. Here she goes again, droning on forever with all her new-agey crap. "I think what happened here is kind of like the Catholic doctrine of confession. It's as if bearing your soul has an immediate effect that saves you from past..." He clicked the conversation dead, then tucked his cell phone away as he moved on, ignoring the crowd of gawkers who had gathered. As a fire engine's siren closed in from the distance, he got into his car and drove home, already imagining the way the story would get retold for his buddies. After getting home, Byron could barely drag his exhausted body to the mattress before dropping asleep. He lay there, grin still alive on his face as the day's events flashed past him like a scene in a horror movie. His dreams were pleasant. And why not? The nightmare was over. Evil had been vanquished. The crushed soul of Sarah was far behind in his rearview mirror, a distant memory as their brief union had been. He lay there face down, ensconced in the delights of pretty maidens, an endless stretch of grass and cloudless skies as far as he could see. But the utopia was interrupted by the knock at his door. He sprang up from the bed, eyes wide. What the hell could be happening now? After trudging to the door and giving his peephole a cautious check, he saw a face he didn't recognize. A pretty one. Blonde, delicate, and soft-smiling. It was as if his dream had reached beyond itself and landed in real life. He couldn't unlock and open the door fast enough. "Hi there," the woman said, even prettier than promised by the preview. But her uniform puzzled him. Navy blue with yellow horizontal stripes. "I'm Miriam." "Hey Miriam," he crooned, leaned against the doorframe. With danger averted, he was ready to get back into the game, and Miriam seemed to be just the player he needed. "What can I do for you?" "Well, you can begin by coming down to the station." "Huh?" "I'm Captain Miriam Rogers with the fire department. According to several witnesses, you were seen leaving a fire scene. We've got some questions for you." He struggled for the words. "Well, maybe I shouldn't have worded that as a question. If you refuse, the police department will have a few questions for you, and you'll probably be answering them in handcuffs." Without another word, he followed the officer to her car. After getting in the passenger seat, he tried to settle his nerves by assuring himself that he'd done nothing wrong, at least nothing anybody could prove. Sure, technically he'd broken into the store and he was indeed there when a fire broke out, but none of this was witnessed by anybody. Was it? Maybe it was. For the time being, Byron had some explaining to do. His mind reeled in search of answers. "You seem a little uneasy, Byron. Anything on your mind?" His mind was flooded with a million troubling thoughts, but the first was his name. He turned to her, panicked. "What did you call me?" "Byron," she said, her polite smile fading and quickly replaced by a seductive one. "That's your name, isn't it?" "Yeah, but I never told you that." "Don't worry, I've been in touch with friends who've filled me in." He had no idea what that could have meant. "Listen, are you sure I have to do this? You don't mind answering a few questions, do you?" "To be honest, there are other things I'd rather be doing right now." "Such as?" They were at a stoplight. Miriam turned, face still in seduction mode, lips pouting as if awaiting a kiss. But Byron had learned his lesson. He figured he now understood the way to avoid future horror, unburdening his guilty conscience. "Look, to be totally honest with you, I've been a bad guy. I've lied to women, I've led them on, I've treated them badly, and what I'd rather be doing right now is something with you that is, let's say, unrelated to the fire." "That's all I needed to hear," she said. The captain spun to a nearby hotel and parked in the rear. The two of them raced inside, and she swung the door open. Inside, there was a bevy of gorgeous women, scantily clad and ready for him. But just when things couldn't have possibly gotten better, flames shot through the door. Within seconds, the room was ablaze. He tried to turn back, but it was too late. "But I was honest," he yelled. "I don't belong here." The reply was laughter, and soon they were gnawing at him, ripping him to ribbons as he begged for mercy, all the while knowing it was too late. He was right where he belonged. The Witch Tape. Like most bad ideas, the whole thing had actually started as a joke. a flippant remark that should really have been swatted away like a persistent fly, or left to dissolve into memory like an indistinct blur of the day's other conversations. It should have been, but it wasn't. Instead, the joke became an idea that grew into a suggestion, and before I knew it, was gathering mass like a snowball rolling downhill, picking up both speed and size the further it was pushed. Within minutes, the joke had grown and mutated into a full-blown plan of action, for which arrangements were already being made. Once the ball gets rolling like that, it's always hard to stop. Bad ideas have a momentum of their own. Moorfield was a quiet town, filled, unfortunately, with not-so-quiet people. The primary forms of entertainment in this tiny rural backwater being either to gossip about other people's intrigues and indiscretions, or actively participate in them yourself for the future discussion of others. As a trio, Adrian, Dion, and I had long ago decided to opt out of both. The day of the joke, we had been walking, as we often did, in the hills that surrounded the town, beers clinking in our rucksacks alongside a hastily thrown-together meal that mainly consisted of bread and crisps. We began the walk with the usual shared sense of having made some kind of escape from town, and the intention of gaining most of our daily calories in liquid form. We made these rambles away from the stultifying boredom of the small town centre and the judgmental glances of the curtain-twitching locals almost every week, and even when the weather was bitingly cold. On those occasions, we would bundle up, find some patch of open moorland to build a fire, set up camp, and merrily drink the cold away, preferring our beer jackets and actual frost to the frosty reception our daytime drinking would have received in town. As usual, we had spent most of the day in the hills overlooking the town, and as adolescent boys tend to do, had exchanged humorously barbed reports of what each of us had done to the other's mother, whilst feeling the warm glow and mildly effervescent fizz of the alcohol beginning to work its magic. Later, we began, as we always did, to head down toward the woods that fringed the town, just as the sun was setting. Our wilderness drinking sojourns were primarily a daytime activity, acting as they did as the precursory warm-up to an evening in one of the 2 pubs in town we would actually get into without being asked for proof of age. On a normal day, we tended to be back before sundown, changing into more suitable pub attire at Adrian's by the time it went dark. We did sometimes stay out, camping in the summer in Dion's brother's battered tent, but never, under any circumstances, did we camp in or near the woods. For though we never discussed it, somehow we all knew instinctively never to be around there at night. Until I made the joke, and that instinct was suppressed and overridden by an immature desire to not appear chicken in front of your friends. In fact, it was at the edge of the woods that I first made the joke that I would come to regret, and where I first saw the filmy brown tangles of unfurried tape hanging in knots from the trees. Looking back now, I remember there being tons of the stuff, marking the entrance to the woods like curtains or bleak decorations for some forgotten pagan festival. But in reality, that first time, I think there was very little, perhaps only a few strands, hung across the path like a barrier, blocking with the flimsiest of barricades the path into the woods that I, more even than the other 2, hated with a passion. I had always hated them. I hated the fact that my route home from the train involved walking through them, down the narrow dirt path, always, it seemed, at dusk. I hated the way that in the cloistered huddle of the streets, the fading light would play tricks on the eyes and show, just at the edge of vision, the tiniest flickers of movement beside you. A movement that always ceased whenever you turned to check, presenting instead only the lightest breeze through the leaves and an empty, almost mocking stillness that, moments earlier, you'd have sworn had not been there. I hated that lonely walk. Watching as the sun began to sink behind the trees, I would hear my own footsteps, the gentle, empty clack of my heel upon the stone path, and listen every time for those other, more subtle sounds. The sounds that hang in the near silence, the sounds of noise, not absent, but withheld, suppressed and smothered by things that wish to go undetected, the stealthy, near silence of predators. I knew it was ridiculous. This was England. Unlike other parts of the world where wolves and bears are a real concern, the largest predator in our woods was a fox or badger, both of which were nocturnal and hardly a threat to humans. I was hardly likely to be gnawed to death by a squirrel. To fear running the predators in Britain's woods was stupid. To fear running into something else, something perhaps not altogether natural, was not only stupider still, but either juvenile or insane. Yet, in the whispering stillness of the near dark, the primal part of my brain still took charge and filled the shadows around me with teeth and claws, sketching in broad, dark strokes the things that watched and lurked there, the things that didn't care if you believed or not, and which, given the chance, would turn you into prey. I would walk that path every night, hating to admit to myself that the dark, rushing in and rising around me like the tide, made me feel on edge. That even in my mid-teens, hurtling at speed toward adulthood and supposedly toward maturity, I still felt the fear churning in my belly when left alone in that wood, still felt the cold electric crackle of hair standing on end every time a branch would snap or a bush rustle when it shouldn't. I suppose it is the curse that comes with imagination. The price you pay for the gift of creativity is that you can't switch it off, and sometimes in place of inspiration, the mind conjures dark things instead. Many was the time that my imagination followed me through those woods like a shadow, clinging and looming in the space just behind me. Sometimes it would inhabit the branches of the trees, making them reach out like thin, brittle fingers, stretching forward to grasp and snare my coat with sharp, taloned nails. They never quite got there. They were only in my mind. Yet, I always felt them trying, and knew how close they'd come. Some days, when the train was late and the sun further toward the horizon, which unfortunately in England is common occurrence, I ran. Sprinting down the hill, though I knew a fall would mean injury, I threw myself perilously forward, feet pounding the gravel, in desperation to be out by dark, rushing against the fading of the light, legs kicking and freewheeling beneath me, so that the trees on either side became a blur, and I would emerge, panting and choked onto the road and the safety of streetlights as night began to fall. Looking back at the path, watching as the woods, smirking at my panic, seemed to close around it, I swore that I'd never go in there at night, and I never did, until I made the joke, and Adrian took me seriously. At the edge of the wood that day, I noticed the tape. It was the tape from inside of an audio cassette. I had seen the same thing on other days, of course, strings of brown celluloid hanging over the wooden gates separating the fields we had to traipse through, or strung haphazardly over the stiles. I had seen it many times, but only this once had decided to comment on it. "Why do people do this?" I asked absent-mindedly, lifting the thin brown film with one finger. "You see it all over. On the sides, on the barbed wire, there's more of this crap caught on the fences than there is sheep's wool. I mean, why bring a tape all the way out here just to wreck the damn thing and leave it everywhere?" Dion shrugged, but as he turned and caught sight of what I was talking about and saw me twirling the tape in my fingers, he cried out, slapping the spool of tape from my hands with a well-aimed blow. "Don't touch that!" he shouted like a primary school teacher scolding a child. I stepped back and regarded him suspiciously, wondering if this was to be another one of his stupid games. The expression on his face, however, convinced me that it wasn't. Whatever had gotten into him, it wasn't good. You don't touch that stuff. It's just bad, okay?" he said before turning and uncharacteristically beginning to walk away. Adrian and I glanced at each other for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Jesus, Dee, I didn't realise you were such a music critic. You must have some bleeding good ears on you if you can tell it's crap even when it's all chewed up like that." Adrian cupped his hand around his ear to gesture that he was listening, as if there actually were, impossibly, a tune playing from the unstrung tape that had met with Dion's disapproval. He shook his head. "I don't hear anything. Oh, wait, something's coming through. Dion, you're right, this is bad. Terrible, in fact. But I thought you liked boy bands." "That's not what I mean," said Dion, sulkily stating the obvious. It's witch tape," he concluded finally. He said it as if the phrase was meant to have great gravitas or mean something to us. In a way it did, but that something was hilarity. "Oh, this is great," I said mockingly, not forgetting but certainly not revealing, as I did, the times that I had sprinted through the woods with the half-heard rumours about witches and black magic in the area close at my heels. "And what, pray tell, is witch tape?" I chortled. "Please don't tell me your mum was recording what we got up to. That would break my heart," Adrian chipped in, never missing an opportunity to call Dion's mother's reputation and chastity into question. Dion glared at him and, ignoring Adrian's comment, decided instead to answer my question. "You can laugh all you want," he began. "Oh, I will, heartily," I replied, but he went on. "You can laugh, but you both know there are some weird people around here that do all that devil-worshipping stuff." Adrian and I, again, shared a glance, though, if pressed, we would both admit to having heard such stories, at least in passing. My brother's mates seen them doing it on Halloween, all running about on the croft, buck naked and dancing and stuff. It's fucking creepy. "I don't know," I added with a wry smirk. "The naked dancing bit sounds like fun. Usually Adrian has to pay for that kind of stuff. Must get a bit nippy in winter, though." Adrian smiled, but Dion, whose voice had taken on a profoundly serious tone, continued. "I'm not laughing. It's true, they do it every year. My brother told me about it." Here, though I mocked, I had to give some leeway. Dion was not alone in having heard such stories. Many was the time I had sat in the school cloakroom on a rainy afternoon and listened to stories about covens and witches in the woods or on the croft. Some said they were killing children or sacrificing chickens, all of them swearing solemn oaths that a friend of a friend had seen witches dancing around a fire or worshipping a goat. Others said that the participants took drugs and engaged in wild orgies, a word that at the time I didn't know the meaning of beyond knowing it was something vaguely sexual. I had heard also about the strange runic markings supposedly carved into the trees in Fuller's Wood, and how if you looked at them for too long, you would wake the next morning to find the same strange letters burnt onto your skin. I had never been in danger of this on account of how I tended to sprint past the trees, any markings not being in my field of vision long enough to be noticed, let alone do any cursing. I had heard too that some of the old folks still insisted on referring to Fuller's Wood by its old local name of Whistling Woods, and that on some old maps it was even labelled that way on account of the strange echoing sighs and moans that were said to come from the trees after dark. Again, I never spent long enough in the woods to test the story's validity. "All right," I conceded. "I'll admit there are some weirdos about, but that doesn't have to do with this stuff." As I said this, I moved my hand as if to touch the tape, but before Dion could object, I had already decided against it. "You're not going to tell me they record all their hocus-pocus bullshit?" Dion looked at me solemnly and nodded. "You mean like black mass and spells and stuff?" Adrian butted in with obvious disbelief in his voice. Again, in silence, Dion simply nodded. But wait, I half laughed. If they record it all, then why would they just wreck the tapes and leave it all over the fucking countryside? I swear, mate, every time you open your mouth you make less sense. It's witchcraft, like a charm or a curse, said Dion, not a hint of humour colouring his response. Once the spell's recorded, they break the plastic, unspool the tape and spread it all over so that it's all across that land. Then it's like they own the place. Sometimes it's a curse, sometimes it's for magic, like conjuring spirits and stuff, but listen, it's just bad. With that, he turned and again began to walk away, proceeding into the woods as if the conversation were over, when in fact it was far from it. It was at this point that I, stupidly, made the joke. Well, guys and ghouls, it's Halloween next week. If they're all going to be out here dancing about in the chud, then we should come back and see if we can see them. I wouldn't mind seeing a bit of witch's nipple. I laughed at my own remark. Dion was not amused, so I glanced around for support from Adrian, who had also raised a smile. As I caught sight of his grin, however, I realised instantly that the joke had been a mistake, for alongside the smile, there was a dangerous, mischievous glint in Adrian's eye. The joke had been taken seriously, and suddenly stopped being funny. Over the course of the next few days, the tape was all Adrian would talk about. He'd been to the library and started reading up on local folklore, the witch trials, and even what he called maleficium. He turned up to school with sheets of badly photocopied pages painted with slashes from his highlighter pen and printouts of microfilm records, newspaper reports relating to witchcraft in the area, and anything dubious relating to Fuller's Wood, reports that were admittedly disconcertingly numerous. "Turns out Professor Van Helsing over here was right," he announced one lunchtime, waving at Dion over yet another spread of news clippings and notes. "The whole tape thing is a proper urban legend. There was a small-scale Satanism hysteria in the mid to late 70s where the media in Britain suddenly got obsessed with the idea of devil worship and people performing black masses and sacrifice and whatnot. Obviously, most of it was bullshit, but the superstition about the tape being littered across the countryside was a genuine belief. People said that they were recordings of spells or rituals." Dion nodded solemnly, oddly proud that his meagre knowledge of local fables had been confirmed. "That's not all, though. If you look at the news reports from around here going back a few years," he pointed a bony finger to a collection of clippings taken from the Gazette and another, now defunct, local newspaper. "Some people totally believed it. The police have been involved in everything, breaking up bands of people dancing naked near Bluebell Croft in Fuller's Wood." He again tapped the finger onto reports, the headlines of which screamed about witches' Sabbath and 4 arrested at naked ceremony. "You know what that means, don't you?" Adrian went on excitedly. Dion and I glared at each other and shook our heads, though of course we had our suspicions. Adrian, in response, threw his hands in the air as if unveiling the conclusion of some great magic trick. "It means spooky sluts and kinky witches. Crazy housewives dancing around with their diabolical dangly bits showing," he cried in a tempestuous swirl of adolescent hormones loud enough to make a few other students turn to look. "Here's the plan. We take Dion's brother's tent, we camp out in Fuller's Wood, and around midnight we creep up to Bluebell Croft with our binoculars and take a peek. It'll be awesome." At the mere mention of the woods, I felt the skin on my scalp tighten as the hair bristled to attention. "Are you mental?" was my pithy response as I tried to laugh the suggestion off as another of Adrian's pipe dreams. To my alarm, however, Dion, who had seemed to be the most honestly fearful of the three of us, was grinning broadly, the promise of seeing a real-life boob overriding any fears of the supernatural he may have held. "I'll tell my folks I'm crashing at yours and you tell your parents you're at mine. My brother has some army-grade binoculars. Might even be able to nick his camera if he's out." "Oh yeah," I replied sarcastically, "and then you'll just wander into Boots and get your pervy pics of some witch's bare ass developed, will you? You'd be arrested, you moron." "Actually," said Dion, elongating the word with exaggerated importance, "my brother uses the dark room at his uni, so if I promised him a copy, I reckon he'd develop them for us. Awesome, Adrian repeated supportively. The grin had not left his face for the last 10 minutes. Saturday night it is then. You guys are serious, aren't you? I asked, desperate for one or the other to say they were joking, to side with me and steer this conversation off its blatantly dangerous path. Instead, they both nodded, and so, 2 days later, I found myself lying to my parents, meeting with Adrian and Dion, and traipsing reluctantly for the first time in my life into Fuller's Wood after sundown. Going into the woods that night, I remained deeply conflicted. Whilst, like any teenage boy, I did not want to appear a coward in front of my friends, the apprehension and fear with which I approached the prospect of entering the woods was obvious, my nerves fighting tooth and nail against my idiot desire to be cool. Several times I tried to persuade the others not to go, presenting barriers and potential problems, some with merit, others invented. Reasons upon reasons why we shouldn't go. I warned about the cold. It was, after all, October in England and bitterly cold. We could catch hypothermia, I insisted, unsure as to whether it was, in fact, something you caught. Or, I insisted, we could get frostbite and lose our toes like those Arctic explorers. These concerns were laughed off with the promise of fire, all-weather sleeping bags, and promises that Dion would snuggle up to me and keep me warm if I got cold. Roundly dismissed, I tried another line of attack. The police, I said, had patrolled the area every Halloween and, as we knew in previous years, had made arrests. How did they think the police would react to 3 teenage boys camping out with binoculars? We didn't want to get in trouble, did we? This worry too was brushed aside, given only a cursory comment even as we advanced toward the tree line. Finally, in desperation, I went for the jugular, exposing the naked nerve, the root of my reservations. What if it's all true? I pleaded. The others only laughed and said they hoped it was. Naked was naked, spooky or not. So, defeated and reluctant, I allowed myself, despite my fears, despite the ice in my belly and the tingling sensation running up my spine, to be cajoled, bullied and pressured into those woods. It would be the last time I'd ever enter them. I have to admit that for the first few hours the experience was not that bad. Alongside the camera and binoculars, the reliably light-fingered Dion had also managed to acquire a few beers from under his brother's bed, whilst Adrian had brought a plastic water bottle full of whiskey, siphoned from one of his dad's bottles, which he had then topped back up with cold black tea mixture he had prepared the night before. "It's the exact same colour," he reliably informed us whilst swigging the genuine article like a pirate from an empty bottle of Malvern. We spent the first few hours after setting up the tent, drinking, telling dirty jokes, and risking salmonella by eating half-raw sausages that were burnt on the outside and worryingly pink within, all the while getting regular time checks from Adrian as he counted down to midnight like he was preparing for a rocket launch. "T-minus 3 hours to titties," he'd announce, never once clarifying how he was privy to the witch's schedule or how he became so certain that they would all be naked. Eventually, however, the hour approached, and we rose to make the short journey to the clearing commonly referred to as Bluebell Croft. This croft was actually just an open area close to the centre of the woods where, in spring, the bluebells that gave the area its name would bloom. In October, however, you were more likely to find frost than flowers. As we rose, slinging our rucksacks onto our backs, I have to admit the alcohol and company had gone some way to chasing away my fears, until we heard the sound. Save for our juvenile laughter and bawdy conversations, the wood had remained, up to that point, relatively noiseless. Every now and again there would be a flutter as a bird changed its position in its roost, or a wheezing echo as a breeze caught the few dry leaves that clung stubbornly to the branches. This sound, however, was different. It rang through the silence with the clarity of a bell, slicing through the night in a shrill, high-pitched shriek. All 3 of us froze. The sound had come from somewhere before us, far beyond the tree line and the few ghostly rows lit by the fire. It had come hurtling and unbeckoned from the dark. An hour earlier, swigging whiskey and laughing in the way you only do as a teen, I had joked that perhaps we wouldn't need to go up to the croft, that perhaps the witches would come looking for us. We had all laughed then. Now, though, standing by the fire where we had set up camp, feeling the dark between the trees slowly creep around us, it felt extremely far from a joke. Behind us, the fire, spurred into life by half a bottle of lighter fluid, cracked and popped, spitting its flickering orange glow up into the air and providing the only source of light save for the glassy white spectres thrown by our torches. This had been a mistake. Coming to the woods had been a mistake, and now, I was sure, we were going to pay for it. Moving closer together, huddling and closing ranks in a way that seemed to mirror the actions already taken by the trees, we each stared into the darkness, listening, straining to catch and then to flinch at every crack of a branch, every whispered rustle, as things unseen brushed through the leaves. Before us, billowing in clouds of condensation, our own breath hung in the frozen air, swirling and dancing as it drifted through the meagre beams of the torchlight. Another crack. Closer now. Bracken fracturing loudly underfoot as something moved slowly between the trees. "There's something in there," said Dion, the words half-throttled by fear. Though all I could see was black, I knew instinctively that he was right. "That scream," I whispered, scared to raise my voice and rouse attention. "What the hell was that?" Adrian answered, though he never took his eyes from the trees. "It sounded like an animal," he said, all the boyish mirth drained from his voice. I knew what he meant. Below the initial piercing cry there was undoubtedly something wild and animalistic about the cry, yet I knew deep down, as I think he did too, that the call was no animal. There was something in the timbre, the full-throated roundness of the cry, that sounded less like a howl and more, far more, like a voice. "We need to get out of here," I remember saying, though I could feel even then my legs turning to liquid beneath me. Slowly and almost in unison, we began to step backward, our eyes fixed before us, and we maneuvered slowly around the fire, back towards the path that would lead us out of the woods, back toward the road, the streetlights, and safety. Until, rising and mewling as if strangled out from the throat of night itself, the call came again, and we three ran. We sprinted headlong, leaving behind the tent and the fire, hurtling with reckless, terrified abandon out of the clearing, onto the path, and down towards town, out of the woods and away from whoever, whatever, had made those awful cries. We ran, it seemed to me, faster than I ever would have thought possible, until Adrian stopped and, with tears, cool and glassy pooling in his eyes, pointed weakly ahead. The spools of tape covered the path, strung across in thick knotted strings from the bare, clawing fingers of the trees. In places, it dropped in thick nests of multiple tendrils, whilst other places it stretched thin and taut, almost to the point of snapping, forming a netted, tangled barrier across the path, forming, it seemed. I allowed the word to form on my lips before I confirmed its awful truth. A web! For bound up within the spools of tape, hanging in pendulous droplets like filmy dark fruit, were bulbous, drooping shapes. Spun around like bobbins, the tape twisted over solid forms that twitched and struggled, fighting against their bonds, small patches of fur and paws protruding at awkward angles as a tiny chorus of baleful howls began to rise and build. Seeing the tiny bodies suspended from the trees like horrific baubles, I remembered the other stories, the headlines I'd only glimpsed, the ones about missing pets. The noise from the animals continued to rise, only to be met and swallowed by another hideous choir. For as the dangling cats and dogs strained against the web and the wind disturbed the tape, voices, speaking their twisted noise, sounds like strange inversions of words, seemed to billow through the trees, as if, by some awkward friction, the voices captured on the tape were pealing forth and rising into the air, and playing. The words and rituals recorded on the now broken tapes spilling and calling from their celluloid tombs until they rose and overlapped, merging into a mess of words, whispers and cries, shouts and murmurs, writhing over one another like serpents in a mating ball. I traced the line of these awful strings, the threads of outspun tape, following their lengths to where they converged and half expecting to see some gigantic spider plump with its feast resting at the centre of its acetate web. Instead, what I saw was a knotted twist of tape as thick as a man's arm that writhed and curled slowly down into a hole that had formed in the ground. I watched, my jaw slack with disbelief, as the tape was gently pulled, wound in like a line or net tugged by a fisherman on shore, and disappeared inch by inch into the hole. I stared in silent disbelief as several of the parcelled creatures, still struggling feebly against their bonds that sang in awful chants, were pulled towards that hole to be slowly and deliberately swallowed. The next thing I knew, there was a hand at my throat. Dion, screaming, his cries drowned out by the multitudes ranting their incantations from the tape, clutched at my collar and tore me backwards away from the path. Then, again, we were running, not along the path, but through the wood itself, branches and roots pulling at our arms, our feet trying with every grasping moment to wrench us back, to fasten upon us and hold us within. That final run was a blur. I didn't, I don't think, even see where I ran. My mind was still fixed on the vision I had seen, not to be swayed, until, panting and trembling in terror, we spilled out onto the road and fell, as a three, to our knees, beneath the streetlight's orange glow. A week later, the Gazette, which had for the previous fortnight carried stories of missing dogs and beloved cats that seemed to have vanished, ran instead with the events of that night, though their account differed greatly from ours, and we three did not feature anywhere in the coverage. Their story did not mention tape. Instead, it told of several arrests, most for indecent exposure. One incident, however, was far more sinister. A woman in her mid-40s was arrested separately from the naked crowd and found to be not only lacking clothes, but streaked from head to toe with animal blood. Initially charged with animal cruelty owing to the carcasses found in the vicinity and later committed to the psychiatric ward, the woman was said to have made a very strange confession. When asked if and indeed why she had stolen and killed these family pets, her response was always the same: a wry, sardonic smile and the phrase, "I fed them to it." We never went back to retrieve the tent, and none of us ever entered those woods again. Leaving the train 2 stops early, I now take a different route home. This has been Scary Stories Collection, 5 short horror stories, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2020 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.